The weight of CRWNS. The moon had died 3 nights ago, swallowed by clouds that refused to part, and in that absolute darkness, Orhan Sahib rode at the head of a column that moved like a serpent through valleys where no light dared to penetrate. The horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth, their breathing muffled by the hands of riders who understood that sound traveled faster than arrows in these cursed hills. Behind him, 2,000 men followed in perfect silence, their armor blackened with ash, their swords drawn but held low against their thighs to prevent any glint that might betray their presence to the watchers who surely waited in the heights above. 3 weeks had passed since the fall of Kalandar, 3 weeks since Orhan had watched that fortress burn and had sworn upon the grave of his father that every stone of every castle held by Shahanshah would know the same fate. The campaign had begun as a righteous answer to years of humiliation, to treaties broken and promises discarded like rotten fruit, but now it had transformed into something far more profound, something that demanded not merely victory but the complete dismantling of an enemy who had believed himself untouchable behind his walls of stone and gold. Orhan rode beside his commander, close enough that their stirrups occasionally touched, and his eyes never stopped moving across the darkness, reading shadows that would have appeared uniform to lesser men. He had spent 17 years perfecting the art of war at Orhan's side, had bled on 4 different battlefields in his commander's defense, and had learned to anticipate danger before it announced itself through the whisper of bowstrings or the scrape of steel. Tonight, his instincts screamed warnings that he could not ignore, and twice already he had signaled for the column to halt while scouts crept forward to investigate sounds that had proven to be nothing more than night animals fleeing the approach of so many men. "The pass opens in another hour," Tarhin whispered, his voice barely distinguishable from the wind that moaned through the rocks. "If they have prepared an ambush, that is where it will come." Orhan nodded slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of the sword that had belonged to his grandfather, the blade that had tasted the blood of 3 Khans and 7 pretenders to thrones that no longer existed. He understood the mathematics of this terrain better than any map could convey, had studied every ridge and every hollow during the long months of planning that had preceded this campaign. The pass ahead was named Kara Bagas by the local tribes, the Black Throat, and it had earned that name through centuries of ambushes that had swallowed entire armies. To enter it at night was madness, but to wait for dawn was to surrender the advantage of surprise that had carried them this far without detection. "We will split the column," Orhan said after a long moment of consideration. "Faladios will take 500 men along the goat paths to the east. They will position themselves above the pass before we enter. If ambush comes, they will become the anvil against which we hammer our enemies into dust." The order passed back through the ranks in whispered fragments, and soon the column rippled as Burhan Faladios separated his contingent and began the treacherous climb toward heights that seemed to merge with the starless sky. Faladios was a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, a commander who had earned his title through deeds so violent that enemy soldiers sometimes fled at the mere rumor of his approach. His face bore scars from 7 duels, each one fought to the death, and his sword arm was said to be guided by angels of vengeance who permitted no enemy to escape his reach. As the main column resumed its advance, Orhan allowed his mind to drift toward the enemy they sought, toward Shahanshah and the fortress of Kalamdar, where that serpent had coiled himself behind walls that had never been breached in 200 years of continuous warfare. Intelligence gathered through torture and bribery had revealed that Shahanshah commanded nearly 8,000 men within those walls, a force that should have been sufficient to withstand any siege, but numbers meant nothing when the spirit that animated them had begun to rot. Deserters had been appearing at Orhan's camp for weeks now, hollow-eyed men who spoke of commanders executed for imagined disloyalties, of food hoarded by officers while common soldiers starved, of an atmosphere of terror within Kalamdar that had transformed a fortress into a prison where every man suspected every other of treachery. The first arrow came without warning, a sound like a hornet passing Orhan's ear, and then the night erupted into chaos as hundreds of shafts descended from positions that should have been empty. Orhan moved with speed that seemed to violate the natural laws of human motion, his shield rising to intercept 3 arrows that would have found Orhan's chest, his body positioning itself between his commander and the source of death. Horses screamed as they fell, riders cursed as they leaped from collapsing mounts, and the discipline that Orhan had spent years instilling in his men prevented what should have been a rout from becoming anything more than a momentary disruption. "Shields!" the command roared through the darkness, and within seconds the column had transformed itself into a defensive formation, men pressing together with overlapping shields that created a roof of iron and leather against the continuing rain of arrows. Orhan's mind worked with cold precision even as death whistled all around him, calculating angles, estimating numbers, determining that perhaps 300 archers occupied the ridges above and that their attack, while fierce, lacked the weight necessary to destroy a force of his size. "They seek to pin us here," Orhan growled, arrows continuing to strike his shield with impacts that numbed his arm, "to hold us until reinforcements arrive." Orhan understood this immediately, recognized the tactical signature of a commander who preferred attrition to decisive engagement, and knew that remaining passive would guarantee the very defeat their enemies sought. He had not ridden through 3 weeks of enemy territory to die in a nameless pass, had not sacrificed 800 men in the siege of Kalandar, only to be bled to death by cowards who refused to meet him blade to blade. "Torches," he commanded, "light them all." This order made no conventional sense, as illumination in such circumstances typically favored the attackers who occupied superior positions, but Orhan's mind had already leaped 3 steps ahead to a conclusion that would only become apparent in the moments to follow. Within seconds, dozens of torches flared to life throughout the column, and the sudden brightness revealed a scene of carnage that would have broken lesser commanders. Bodies of men and horses lay scattered across the rocky ground, arrows still quivering in flesh, and blood ran in streams that reflected the flickering firelight like rivers of liquid copper. But the torches also revealed the positions of the archers above, silhouettes that became visible against the slightly lighter sky as men moved to adjust their aim toward newly illuminated targets. And from the eastern heights, where Faladios and his 500 had climbed, there came a sound that transformed despair into something approaching ecstasy, the thunder of men descending with drawn swords onto enemies who had believed themselves invisible and unreachable. Faladios led the charge personally, his blade already wet with the blood of the first sentry who had died without ever knowing that death approached. His men swept across the ridge like a flood, and archers who had been confident in their concealment found themselves fighting hand-to-hand against warriors who had trained their entire lives for precisely this kind of close-quarters butchery. Screams replaced the whisper of bowstrings, and within minutes the arrow storm that had threatened Orhan's column simply ceased as those who had launched it died or fled into darkness that no longer protected them. From below, Orhan watched the massacre unfold with grim satisfaction, noting how Faladios seemed to flow from one enemy to the next without pause, his sword describing arcs that left bodies in its wake. When the last of the ambushers had been cut down, silence returned to the pass, a silence broken only by the groans of wounded men and the occasional crash of a body rolling down the slope to land among those it had sought to kill. "We have lost perhaps 200, Orhan reported, having surveyed the casualties with the practiced eye of a man who had counted dead soldiers more times than he could remember. Another 100 wounded badly enough that they cannot continue." Orhan absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally he mourned every man whose journey had ended in this godless place. Each death represented not merely a loss of military strength but an obligation, a debt of vengeance that could only be repaid through the ultimate destruction of those who had orchestrated this attack. Shahanshah had reached out from behind his walls to strike at Orhan's force, had demonstrated that his network of informants and allied tribes extended further than initial intelligence had suggested, and this revelation demanded a response that would echo through generations. "We cannot leave the wounded for them to find," Orhan said quietly. "See that they are made comfortable and leave 50 men to guard them until they can be evacuated. The rest of us continue. We move faster now." The column reformed around its diminished numbers, and now the silence of careful approach was abandoned in favor of speed that bordered on recklessness. Orhan understood that surprise had been partially compromised, that riders were surely already speeding toward Kalamdar with news of the engagement in the pass, and that every hour of delay would allow Shahanshah to strengthen preparations for the storm that approached. The calculation was simple: reach the fortress before its defenses could be perfected, or face a siege that might consume months that Orhan did not have. Dawn found them emerging from the hills into a valley that stretched toward distant walls, and for the first time, Orhan beheld the fortress of Kalamdar with his own eyes rather than through the descriptions of scouts and the sketches of spies. It rose from the earth like a mountain that had been carved by giants, its towers reaching toward clouds that gathered in the east with the promise of rain, its walls thick enough to resist any conventional siege engine, its position commanding approaches from every direction so completely that any attacking force would be exposed to murderous fire for nearly a mile before reaching the base of the fortifications. By Allah's grace, Faladio's breathed, having rejoined the column after descending from the heights where his men had slaughtered the ambushers. They could hold that against 10 times our number. This assessment was not pessimism but simple reality, and Orhan accepted it as such while his mind worked through possibilities that would have seemed impossible to men of lesser vision. He had not come this far to throw his soldiers against walls that could not be scaled, had not sacrificed so much to dash his army to pieces against stone that laughed at human ambition. Victory here would require weapons more subtle than swords, strategies more devastating than frontal assault, and patience that might seem to border on passivity while the true mechanisms of destruction did their invisible work. "Make camp," Orhan ordered, "not here but there." He pointed toward a rise that offered both defensive advantage and a clear view of the fortress, "and ensure that our presence is visible from those walls. I want them to see how few we are. I want them to believe that we have come to negotiate." The camp took shape throughout the morning, tents erected in orderly rows that conveyed professional discipline while simultaneously appearing far too modest to represent a serious military threat. Orhan supervised every detail personally, ensuring that the camp presented exactly the image he wished to project: a delegation rather than an army, a force that had arrived to discuss terms rather than to prosecute war. Within Kalamdar's walls, he knew, this display would generate confusion and debate, would set different factions against each other as they argued about intentions and appropriate responses, and this internal discord was precisely the first crack he needed to begin the demolition of Shahanshah's confidence. Orhan approached as the camp neared completion, his expression troubled in ways that spoke of objections he was reluctant to voice. Orhan had learned long ago to value such hesitation, to recognize it as the mark of a counselor wise enough to question but loyal enough to ultimately obey. "Speak," Orhan said simply. "They will send scouts to determine our true numbers," Orhan replied. "When they discover that our force is genuinely small, they may attack rather than negotiate." "They may," Orhan agreed, "or they may assume that this visible camp represents merely an advance guard, that a larger force follows and has not yet arrived. Uncertainty is a weapon, old friend. Let them wonder. Let them debate. Every hour they spend in council arguing about our intentions is an hour when their walls do them no good." The first contact came in the late afternoon, when a small group of riders emerged from the fortress gates and approached the camp under a banner of truce. Orhan received them with elaborate courtesy, offering water and food to men who clearly had not expected such hospitality from an enemy who had burned Kalandar to the ground and massacred its garrison to the last man. The leader of the delegation was an older warrior named Mahmud, whose face revealed nothing but whose eyes betrayed the desperate curiosity of a man who needed to understand what he was facing. "Shahanshah asks why you have come," Mahmud said, his voice carrying the formal cadences of a practiced diplomat. "These lands have known peace between your peoples for many years." "Peace built on broken oaths," Orhan replied, his tone mild but carrying edges that cut through the diplomatic pleasantries. "Peace that your master violated when he offered sanctuary to those who murdered my kinsmen. Peace that ceased to exist when caravans under my protection were raided by bandits wearing Shahanshah's colors. I have come to discuss the restoration of true peace if such a thing remains possible." These words contain truth wrapped in deception, genuine grievances employed to mask the true scope of Orhan's intentions. He had no interest in negotiated peace, no desire for anything less than Shahanshah's complete destruction, but the fiction of diplomatic openness served purposes that would only become apparent in the days to come. Mahmud and his companions departed with assurances that Shahanshah would consider Orhan's words, that further discussion might be possible, that perhaps the differences between them could be resolved without additional bloodshed. That night, as the camp settled into routines of watchfulness that would persist throughout the siege, Orhan gathered his senior commanders for council. Falladio sat with barely contained impatience, his desire for immediate action visible in every line of his battle-scarred face. Orhan occupied his customary position at Orhan's right hand, his silence speaking volumes about assessments he had already shared in private. Damir Khan, the young commander who had proven himself during the Kalandar siege, sat with the alertness of a man who understood that every word spoken in this tent might determine whether he lived to see another campaign. "The fortress cannot be taken by storm," Orhan began, stating the obvious to establish the foundation for what would follow. "Its walls are too high, too thick, and too well manned. Any direct assault would spend lives we cannot afford to lose and accomplish nothing beyond demonstrating our weakness. Therefore, we will not assault it." This declaration produced confusion that rippled across faces trained to conceal emotion, and Orhan allowed the silence to extend until the tension became almost unbearable before continuing. "We will take it from within," he said, "through fear, through hunger, through the destruction of every certainty that allows Shahanshah to sleep peacefully at night. Within those walls are 8,000 men, but they are not united. Intelligence tells us that Shahanshah has executed 6 of his own commanders in the past month, that he sees traitors in every shadow, that his paranoia has created factions who despise each other almost as much as they despise us. We will feed that paranoia. We will make him see enemies where none exist until he destroys himself more thoroughly than our swords ever could." The plan that unfolded over the following hours was intricate beyond anything Orhan's commanders had previously conceived, a web of deceptions and provocations designed to transform Kalamdar from a fortress into a tomb. Agents would be infiltrated through the network of tunnels that scout reports indicated existed beneath the walls, men chosen for their ability to blend among the garrison and whisper rumors that would spread like fire through dry grass. Supplies that should have flowed to the fortress would be intercepted, not through blockade that would announce hostile intent, but through bribes to merchants and threats to caravan masters that would make delivery seem too dangerous to attempt. And prisoners taken during the pass ambush would be released with stories carefully crafted to suggest that powerful figures within Kalamdar had provided intelligence to Orhan's forces, stories that would reach Shahanshah's ears and deepen the suspicions that already tormented his knights. "How long?" Faladios asked, his voice betraying frustration that he could not entirely conceal. "How long before we actually fight?" "Fighting will come," Orhan assured him, "but it will come when the enemy is weakened, divided, and desperate. Would you rather spend 1,000 lives taking those walls by force or 12 lives creating conditions where those walls mean nothing? Patience is not weakness, Faladios. It is strength that lesser men lack the vision to employ." The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of apparent inactivity that concealed ferocious purpose. Orhan received another delegation from the fortress, and another, each time offering terms for peace that he knew Shahanshah would never accept, each time gathering intelligence through seemingly innocent conversation about conditions within the walls. He learned that the garrison's food supplies were already stretched thin due to corruption among the quartermasters, that water from the fortress wells had developed a brackish taste that some attributed to poison introduced by unknown enemies, that 3 more commanders had been arrested, and 1 executed for crimes that no one could clearly articulate. Orhan returned one evening from a reconnaissance mission with news that widened Orhan's strategic possibilities significantly. A force of perhaps 1,500 cavalry had departed the fortress through a gate that opened onto the mountains, their direction suggesting an attempt to circle around and attack the siege camp from an unexpected direction. But Orhan had tracked them through the hills, had observed their route and estimated their timing, and now presented his commander with an opportunity that demanded immediate exploitation. "They will reach the northern approach by tomorrow night," Orhan reported. "If we move tonight, we can prepare a reception that they will not expect." Orhan considered the mathematics of this engagement with care that bordered on obsession. Committing forces to intercept the cavalry sortie would weaken the camp's defenses during the most vulnerable hours, would create an opportunity that Shahanshah might exploit if he possessed accurate intelligence about the disposition of forces. But allowing that cavalry force to operate freely would permit harassment that could continue indefinitely, would demonstrate weakness that might encourage further sorties, and would surrender initiative that Orhan had fought to maintain throughout the campaign. "Take 1,000 men," Orhan decided. "Faladios will command the ambush. I will remain here with the camp's defense. If Shahanshah sends another sortie while you engage the first, we will hold until you return." Faladios received this assignment with visible satisfaction, his appetite for combat finally finding prospect of satiation after days of diplomatic maneuvering that had chafed against his warrior's nature. He selected his 1,000 with care, choosing men who rode well and fought better, whose discipline would hold even in the chaos of night combat, whose loyalty to each other would prevent the fragmentation that often transformed ambushes into disasters. They departed as the sun touched the horizon, their route planned to use terrain features that would conceal their movement from any watchers on the fortress walls. Orhan watched them go with the strange mixture of pride and fear that always accompanied the dispatch of men to battle, knowing that some who rode now would not return, hoping that those sacrifices would purchase advantages worthy of the price. The night passed with terrible slowness, each sound from the fortress magnified by imagination into the beginnings of attack, each hour stretching toward infinity as Orhan waited for news that might bring triumph or disaster. Orhan commanded the camp's defenses with characteristic efficiency, ensuring that watches remained alert, that reserves stayed ready, that nothing would find them unprepared should Shahanshah choose this moment to test their strength. Dawn arrived without assault, and with it came riders bearing news that transformed the tactical situation in ways Orhan had anticipated but could never have guaranteed. Faladios had achieved complete surprise, had fallen upon the enemy cavalry in a narrow valley where their numbers meant nothing, had slaughtered over 1,000 men while losing fewer than 100 of his own. Among the prisoners taken was a commander of sufficient rank that his interrogation might yield intelligence of extraordinary value, and Faladios was even now returning to camp with this prize and the spoils of a victory that would echo through Kalimdar's halls like thunder. "Prepare a place for the prisoner," Orhan ordered. "I will speak with him personally, and I will know everything he knows before the sun sets today." The commander's name was Abdul Rahman, and he was brought before Orhan with the dignity that his rank deserved despite the circumstances of his capture. His wounds had been treated, his thirst quenched, and when he stood before Orhan, he did so as a man rather than a broken thing, which suggested that useful conversation might prove possible. "You serve a master who rewards loyalty with suspicion and competence with execution," Orhan began, his voice carrying neither cruelty nor false sympathy, merely the observation of facts that Abdul Rahman could not deny. "6 commanders have died at Shahanshah's hand in the past month. How long before your name appeared on his list of those whose loyalty he questioned?" Abdul Rahman's face revealed the impact of these words, the recognition that Orhan possessed intelligence that should have been impossible for an outsider to obtain, and the terrifying implications of that penetration for any who still served within Kalimdar's walls. "He fears shadows," Abdul Rahman admitted after a silence that stretched uncomfortably. "Every setback becomes evidence of treachery. Every success by his enemies becomes proof that someone close to him has betrayed his plans. The fortress is strong, but the man who commands it has become weak in ways that stone cannot remedy." The conversation that followed yielded more than Orhan had dared hope, a detailed picture of the factions within Kalimdar, of commanders who despised each other and united only in their growing fear of the tyrant they served, of supplies dwindling faster than official reports acknowledged, of morale collapsing under the weight of executions and suspicions that spared no one regardless of their previous service. Abdul Rahman spoke not as a traitor but as a man who had finally acknowledged truths that loyalty had prevented him from facing, and when he finished, he sat in silence that seemed to weigh upon him like armor grown too heavy to bear. "You may serve me," Orhan offered, "or you may return to Shahanshah with a message that I will dictate. The choice determines whether you live to see your family again or die in a futile defense of walls that cannot protect a master who has already forgotten how to trust." Abdul Rahman chose service, and with that choice Orhan acquired more than a source of intelligence. He acquired a symbol that could be deployed against the very foundations of Shahanshah's power. Word would spread that a senior commander had defected, had chosen the invader over the master he had served for 15 years, and every man within Kalimdar would wonder if his neighbor, his subordinate, his superior might make the same choice tomorrow. The siege settled into a pattern that resembled peace more than war, days passing with no visible aggression while invisible forces worked to accelerate the decay within the fortress. Orhan received reports of desertions increasing, of soldiers who slipped over the walls at night and fled toward villages where they might disappear into the civilian population. He learned of a supply caravan that had been within a day's march of the fortress, but had turned back after its guards were paid more to retreat than they would have earned by completing their delivery. He heard rumors that Shahanshah had begun sleeping in a different location each night, that his food was tested by multiple tasters before he would touch it, that he had stopped appearing in public assemblies for fear of assassination. And then, on the 14th night of the siege, fire erupted within Kalimdar's walls. The blaze began in the granaries, whether through accident, sabotage, or the divine intervention that sometimes favored the righteous, and by the time it was noticed, the flames had already consumed stores that would have fed the garrison for weeks. Orhan watched from a ridge overlooking the camp as orange light painted the fortress towers, as smoke rose in columns that obscured stars that had watched over 1,000 sieges before this one. Screams carried across the distance, chaos visible even at this range as men who should have been defending walls instead fought to save food that meant the difference between survival and starvation. "Now?" Faladios asked, his hand already on his sword, his body vibrating with anticipation. "Not yet," Orhan replied, though the same hunger for decisive action burned in his own heart. "The fire weakens them, but it also unites them against a common enemy. Let them save what they can. Let them discover how little remains. Let them sit with that knowledge through the days that follow, and then we will see who still possesses the will to resist. The fire burned through the night and into the morning, and when it finally died, Kalimdar had lost perhaps a third of its remaining provisions. Delegation after delegation emerged from the gates now, no longer offering negotiations but pleading for terms that might allow honorable surrender, and each time Orhan rejected their proposals with demands that grew increasingly impossible to accept. He did not want surrender, not yet. He wanted Shahanshah broken so completely that the man's destruction would serve as a lesson to every petty tyrant who might dream of defying Orhan's authority in the years to come. On the 17th day, Yakut emerged from the fortress. Orhan had known this man by reputation long before the siege began, had studied his career with the attention that wise commanders devote to enemies of exceptional capability. Yakut had been Shahanshah's most trusted captain, had commanded the forces that defended the eastern provinces during the campaigns of the previous decade, had earned a name that mothers invoked to frighten children who would not sleep. He had also been, according to intelligence that Orhan had received from multiple sources, the architect of the raid that had killed Orhan's youngest brother 3 years ago, the commander who had ordered the massacre of an entire caravan merely to prevent witnesses from revealing the involvement of Shahanshah's forces. Faladios stiffened visibly when Yakut's banner was identified approaching the camp, and Orhan understood immediately that the hatred his commander felt toward this man ran deeper than any strategic calculation could address. "You will not kill him," Orhan said quietly, placing a restraining hand on Faladios's arm. "Not yet, and not without purpose." "He murdered my brother's son," Faladios replied, his voice carrying heat that threatened to overflow the boundaries of discipline. "At Vardhan Pass, when the boy had already surrendered, he cut the child's throat and left the body for dogs to find." "I know," Orhan said, and his voice carried weight that silenced further objection. "And he will answer for that crime and for all his other crimes in a manner that serves our purposes rather than merely satisfying your grief. Trust me, old friend, justice will come." Yakut approached the camp with an escort of 50 riders, all bearing weapons but none displaying them aggressively. His face showed the strain of days under siege, but his bearing remained that of a man who believed himself the equal of any he might face. When he dismounted before Orhan's tent, his bow was shallow enough to convey respect without submission, the greeting of an enemy rather than a supplicant. "Shahanshah sends me to discuss terms," Yakut announced, his voice carrying clearly to the hundreds of soldiers who had gathered to witness this meeting. "He recognizes that this conflict serves neither of our peoples, and he wishes to find a path toward peace that preserves honor on all sides." "There is no honor to preserve," Orhan replied flatly. "There is only justice to be rendered and debts to be paid. Your master broke oaths that should have been sacred. He offered shelter to murderers. He sent raiders against those under my protection. If he wishes peace, he may surrender himself and his fortress to my judgment, and I will determine what mercy, if any, his situation warrants." These terms were impossible, designed to be rejected, and Yakut's smile as he heard them suggested that he had expected nothing less. The negotiation that followed was a performance more than a genuine attempt to reach agreement, each side testing the other's resolve, each searching for weaknesses that might be exploited in the continued confrontation. When Yakut finally departed with nothing accomplished, both commanders understood that the next phase of the conflict would be written in blood rather than words. "He wanted to see our camp," Orhan observed after the enemy delegation had withdrawn, "to count our numbers, assess our supplies, determine our strength." "And we allowed him to see exactly what we wished him to see," Orhan confirmed. "Confidence without desperation, strength without overextension. Let him report to Shahanshah that we can maintain this siege indefinitely, that time favors us rather than them, that every day that passes deepens their predicament while we grow stronger through rest and the arrival of supplies from friendly territories." But Orhan knew that time was not entirely his ally, that forces beyond this immediate conflict imposed limitations on how long he could maintain presence before obligations elsewhere demanded his attention. The empire he served would not wait forever while he pursued personal vengeance against a single fortress, however strategically important, and whispers had already reached him of troubles brewing in the western provinces that might require his attention before the winter snows closed the mountain passes. Victory here needed to come soon, or the advantages he had accumulated might evaporate as quickly as morning mist under a determined sun. The solution came from an unexpected direction, carried by a messenger who arrived at the camp on the 19th day bearing letters whose contents transformed Orhan's understanding of the situation entirely. Within Kalimdar, it seemed, a faction had formed around commanders who had lost all faith in Shahanshah's leadership, men who saw the siege as a death sentence, and who understood that continued resistance served no purpose beyond delaying an inevitable defeat. These commanders had made contact with agents that Orhan had infiltrated weeks earlier, and now they offered something that no amount of military force could have achieved: the gates of Kalimdar, opened from within, on a night when those loyal to Shahanshah would be neutralized through means that required no external assistance. "It is too convenient," Faladios argued when Orhan shared this intelligence with his senior commanders. "They know we have agents among them. This could be a trap, an invitation to commit forces to an assault that will be slaughtered in prepared killing grounds." "All war involves risk," Orhan replied. "The question is whether the potential reward justifies the danger. If this offer is genuine, we end the siege in a single night and capture a fortress that would otherwise cost us months and thousands of lives. If it is a trap, we lose the forces committed to the assault, but our main strength remains to continue the siege through other means." The debate continued through the night. Arguments advanced and countered, risks weighed against rewards, until finally Orhan imposed the decision that only he could make. "We accept," he declared, "but we prepare for betrayal. Faladios will lead the assault force through the gates if they open, but Tarhan will position reserves to cover withdrawal if the situation proves hostile. I will remain with the reserves, ready to reinforce success or prevent disaster depending on how events unfold." The night chosen for the attempt arrived with clouds that blocked the moon, darkness so complete that men could barely see their own hands, conditions that favored deception in equal measure for both sides. Faladios led 500 men toward the designated gate, their approach silent despite the weight of arms and armor they carried, their hearts pounding with anticipation that no veteran ever learned to fully suppress. Orhan waited with the reserves, his position on a slight rise that allowed observation of the fortress walls despite the darkness. Tarhan stood beside him, both men barely breathing as they strained to detect any indication of what was happening beyond their sight. Minutes stretched into hours, and the absence of alarm suggested either that the approach had gone undetected, or that a trap was being sprung so carefully that no warning would precede its closure. And then the gates opened. Torches flared within the fortress, revealing silhouettes of men fighting men, the clash of steel on steel audible even at this distance. Faladios plunged through the opening with his 500, and behind them poured the chaos of a fortress tearing itself apart as faction battled faction for control of walls that had protected them all until this night of mutual destruction. Now Orhan commanded, and the reserves surged forward to reinforce success that exceeded any reasonable expectation. The battle within Kalimdar lasted until dawn, a nightmare of corridor fighting and courtyard massacres, of ambushes in stairwells and desperate last stands in towers that had witnessed centuries of history before this night of blood. Shahanshah's loyalists fought with the fury of men who knew that surrender meant death, while the rebels who had opened the gates discovered that their new allies showed little interest in distinguishing between those who had supported the conspiracy and those who had opposed it. By the time the sun rose over walls that now belonged to Orhan, the garrison of 8,000 had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 prisoners, the rest dead or fled into countryside where pursuit would eventually find them. Shahanshah himself was found in a hidden chamber beneath his personal quarters, a space that had been prepared for exactly this eventuality but whose location had been betrayed by the same commanders who had opened the gates. He stood before Orhan without chains, his bearing defiant despite the complete collapse of everything he had built, his eyes burning with hatred that no defeat could extinguish. "You believe you have won," Shahanshah said, his voice steady despite circumstances that would have broken lesser men. "But this fortress is merely stone. Its fall means nothing. Others will rise against you, and the methods that succeeded here will fail against enemies who learn from my mistakes." "Perhaps," Orhan acknowledged, "but you will not live to see those struggles. Your crimes demand answers, and justice has waited too long already." The execution took place at noon, in the central courtyard where Shahanshah had once dispensed judgments that had terrorized those beneath his authority. Orhan allowed the surviving prisoners to witness, ensuring that every man who left Kalimdar alive would carry testimony of what happened to those who defied him. The death was neither quick nor merciful, a statement rather than a simple execution, and when it finally ended, silence settled over the fortress with a weight that seemed to press against the very stones. But one matter remained unresolved, and Faladios approached Orhan as the body was removed, his face carrying the same controlled fury that had burned there since Yakid's visit to the camp. "Where is he?" Faladios demanded. "Among the prisoners, among the dead, my men have searched everywhere. Yakid has escaped." This news struck Orhan with force he had not anticipated, the realization that the victory he had achieved remained incomplete in ways that would haunt him until the outstanding debt was paid. Yakid had fled during the chaos, had slipped away while attention focused on the fortress's fall, and now he wandered free with knowledge of Orhan's methods and burning motivation for vengeance. "He cannot have gone far," Orhan said, though doubt colored his voice. "Send riders to every village, every road, every crossing point. Offer gold for information and death for those who shelter him. We have taken the fortress, but the campaign does not end until Yakid answers for his crimes." The hunt began immediately, riders dispersing in every direction to cast a net across the countryside, while Orhan established his authority over Kalimdar through appointments that rewarded loyalty and promised punishment for resistance. Days passed without news of Yakid's whereabouts, and the escaped commander seemed to have vanished as completely as smoke scattered by wind. And then, on the 5th day after the fortress fell, a rider arrived bearing news that transformed frustration into something approaching despair. Yakid had reached the court of Malik al-Yadin, a neighboring lord whose neutrality during the siege had been purchased through assurances that his territories would not become battlefields. There, under the protection of diplomatic sanctuary, the fugitive had begun assembling men who had fled Kalimdar's fall, forming the nucleus of a force that might, given time, become a genuine threat. Worse still, rumors suggested that Malik al-Yadin's neutrality was wavering, that Yakid's whispered promises of future rewards had found receptive ears, that the alliance structure upon which Orhan had built his campaign might be crumbling beneath his feet. "We cannot attack al-Yadin without provocation," Orhan counseled when this intelligence was shared. "To do so would confirm every accusation our enemies level against us, that we seek conquest rather than justice, that our word cannot be trusted, that alliance with us provides no protection against our ambition. And yet we cannot allow Yakid to rebuild while we sit idle," Faladios countered. "Every day he breathes is an insult to those he murdered. Every alliance he forges is a dagger aimed at everything we have accomplished." Orhan listened to his commanders argue, his mind working through possibilities that seemed to lead nowhere acceptable. The situation demanded action, but every action carried consequences that threatened to unravel his larger purposes. Patience risked allowing enemies to regroup, but aggression risked creating new enemies where none had existed before. The answer, when it came to him, required neither patience nor aggression but something far more subtle, a provocation carefully designed to appear as Yakid's initiative rather than Orhan's manipulation. If al-Yadin could be convinced that his guest had become a liability rather than an asset, if circumstances could be arranged so that expelling Yakid seemed to serve al-Yadin's interests rather than Orhan's, then the fugitive would find himself without sanctuary, exposed to the justice that had pursued him since Kalimdar's fall. "Send word to al-Yadin," Orhan commanded. "Express our gratitude for his continued neutrality, our understanding that hosting refugees falls within the obligations of hospitality that govern relations between civilized lords. Make clear that we seek no quarrel with him, that our only interest is in those directly responsible for crimes against our house." And then, his voice dropped to a tone that his commanders recognized as the prelude to calculation they would spend weeks implementing. Arrange for Yakid to do something that not even the most generous interpretation of hospitality can excuse. The details of this arrangement would require time, resources, and deceptions layered upon deceptions, until truth became indistinguishable from fabrication. But Orhan had grown skilled at such manipulations, had learned through years of conflict that the battlefield of perception often proved more decisive than the battlefield of steel. Yakid would destroy himself or appear to destroy himself, and when he fell, it would seem to all observers that justice had finally caught a criminal rather than that a hunter had finally cornered his prey. As night settled over Kalimdar, Orhan stood upon walls that had resisted siege for 2 centuries before yielding to his combination of force and subtlety. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided conquerors since the dawn of history, and somewhere in the darkness, enemies plotted his destruction while allies questioned how long they could trust a man whose methods proved so effective against those who opposed him. The fortress was his, but the war continued in forms that no walls could contain. Yakid breathed somewhere beyond the horizon, nursing hatred that would not fade until one of them was dead. Al-Yadin weighed options that could tip the balance of power across an entire region. And in capitals further still, rulers who had watched this campaign with interest were surely drawing conclusions about what it meant and what responses it demanded. Orhan understood all of this, accepted the weight of challenges that would multiply faster than victories could address them, and prepared himself for a tomorrow that promised nothing except continued struggle. The path of conquest led only to more conquest, each victory creating new enemies, each success raising stakes until the final accounting that waited for all men who sought to impose their will upon an unwilling world. But that accounting lay in the future, and tonight, Orhan allowed himself a moment of satisfaction that the walls beneath his feet belonged to him, that the enemy who had defied him was dead, and that the men who had followed him through danger and uncertainty could rest secure in the knowledge that their commander had once again proven equal to the challenges that fate had placed before him. Tomorrow, the hunt for Yakid would intensify. Tomorrow, the web of diplomacy and deception would extend toward new targets. Tomorrow, the campaign would continue toward conclusions that remained hidden in mists that even the wisest could not penetrate. But tonight, Kalimdar slept under new masters, and the fire that had consumed its granaries still smoldered in corners where embers refused to accept that their time had passed. And in the darkness beyond the walls, riders moved toward destinations that would determine whether this victory marked a culmination or merely another step in a conflict whose true dimensions had not yet been revealed. The cold of the northern highlands did not merely settle upon the skin. It sank into the bone, heavy and damp, smelling of rotting pine needles and wet clay. In the deep shadow of the pine canopy, where the needles were so thick they muffled the sound of 2,000 horses, Orhan Sahib rode with his chin tucked into the fur collar of his cloak, his eyes fixed on the narrow trail that wound upward into the mist. It was 3 nights after the fall of Kalimdar, 3 nights since they had discovered the bitter truth that had turned their victory into a handful of cold ash. The man they had executed in the courtyard, the one who had stood so defiantly before the sword, whose head had rolled across the stones of the central square, was not Shahanshah. It had been Alauddin Sahib, a cousin of the ruler, a man whose features had been carved by the same bloodline and whose sacrifice had been bought with the promise of safety for his wives and children in the lands beyond the great river. The real Shahanshah, manipulative to the last, increasingly desperate but still possessing the cunning of an old wolf, had slipped through the subterranean water gates hours before the final assault, guided by the traitor Yakid and a handful of loyalists who had known the secret paths through the mountain routes. Beside Orhan Sahib, the great swordsman Turhan rode in silence, his hand never far from the hilt of his heavy blade. He did not look at the path, he looked at the trees, at the gray mists that drifted between the massive trunks like the ghosts of the men they had left behind in the trenches of Kalimdar. He had seen many deceptions in his years of service, but this one, this substitution of a decoy to buy a tyrant's escape, had wounded his pride more than any arrow. He felt the weight of the failure as if it were his own, and every rustle of the wind through the wet branches brought his hand closer to his steel. He knew that the enemy they pursued was no longer just a king in exile. Shahanshah was now a wounded beast, cornered and frantic, and a beast in such a state was twice as dangerous as one secure behind stone walls. As the night deepened, the dampness turned to a fine, freezing rain that slicked the rocks and made the horses stumble on the steep incline. Behind them, the column stretched like a black ribbon, the men silent, their torches unlit to avoid alerting the scouts of Alauddin Sahib, the regional lord whose territory they were now invading without permission or warning. It was a dangerous gamble, this crossing of the border, but Orhan Sahib knew that to hesitate was to allow Shahanshah and Yakid to reach the safety of the deeper valleys, where they could raise a new army from the disgruntled clans who still resented the central authority. He had called upon his most trusted captains for this pursuit, Damir Khan, who commanded the rearguard with a patience that bordered on the unnatural, Mahmud, whose knowledge of these northern passes had been gathered during the wars of his youth, and Abdul Rahman, the defector from Kalimdar who now rode with a noose of suspicion around his neck, trying to prove with every breath that his loyalty belonged to the new master of the fortress. "The border stone is 3 miles ahead," Mahmud said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried above the sound of the rain. "Beyond that lies the valley of the Red Willow. If Alauddin Sahib has deployed his watchers, they will be positioned at the old watchtower near the stream. We cannot pass them without being seen." Orhan Sahib did not slow his horse. "Then we must ensure they have no eyes to see with. Tarhan, take 3 men, let the shadows do the work before the horses reach the ford." Tarhan vanished into the mist without a word, slipping from his saddle and leaving his mount with a young trooper. He was a creature of the dark when the hunt demanded it, his movements as silent as the fog that clung to the damp earth. With him went 2 of his best scouts, men who had learned the art of the knife in the southern deserts where a single sound could bring 100 spears down upon a camp. They moved through the thick undergrowth, their leather armor treated with oil to prevent any creak, their breath coming in slow, controlled gasps that did not mist in the cold air. The watchtower was a crumbling pillar of gray basalt, built in the reign of some forgotten Khan, and now used only by the border guards of Alauddin Sahib to watch for cattle thieves and small war parties. Tonight, 3 men sat around a small fire built in the shelter of the ruined base, their cloaks wrapped tight against the damp chill, their spears leaning against the stone behind them. They were cold, tired, and secure in the belief that no army would attempt the mountain passes in such weather. One of them, a stout man with a heavy beard named Kuludz, was grumbling about the quality of the firewood, his hands extended toward the pale green flame that struggled to burn the wet pine. He never heard the rustle of the leaves behind him. Orhan's hand came from the darkness, thick and calloused, sealing Kuludz's mouth before the shout could form in his throat, while the long dagger found the soft space between the shoulder blades, slipping in with a wet hiss that was lost in the patter of the rain. At the same instant, the other two guards were taken, their lives departing in silence as the scouts moved with the synchronized precision of men who had done this 100 times before. The fire flickered undisturbed by the brief struggle, its light reflecting in the pooling blood that began to stain the wet pine needles around the stones. When Orhan Sahib reached the watchtower, the three bodies had been dragged into the underbrush, and Orhan stood by the path, his blade already wiped clean and returned to its sheath. He gave a single brief nod, and the column pressed forward without stopping, crossing the shallow ford where the water ran black and cold over the round river stones. They were in Al-Aliuddin Sahib's territory now, a land of narrow valleys and high ridges where every village was a potential fortress and every peasant was a potential scout for the local lord. "The path narrows here," Abdul Rahman whispered, his horse crowding close to Orhan Sahib's. "If Yaqid has reached the village of Jarkata, he will have warned them. The people there are loyal to the old line. They will not welcome our banners, and they will know the paths through the forest better than we do." "Then we will not use the paths," Orhan Sahib replied, his eyes cold. "We will go through the high ridges. Let them wait for us in the valleys. We will descend upon them from the clouds." It was a grueling climb, one that tested the endurance of both men and horses to their absolute limits. The slope was nearly vertical in places, the soil loose and slick with the rain, and more than once a horse lost its footing, sliding down into the darkness with a frantic thrashing of legs that ended in a dull, distant thud at the bottom of the ravine. The men did not speak. They held the reins with numb fingers, their teeth clenched, their muscles burning from the constant strain of keeping their balance on the treacherous incline. By midnight, they had reached the high ridge, where the wind screamed across the bare rock, carrying with it the scent of snow from the higher peaks. Below them, the valley of the Red Willow lay spread out like a dark tapestry, the small fires of the villages blinking like dying stars in the distance. It was here that they made their cold camp, refusing to light fires that might betray their position to the watchers below. They huddled together in the lee of the rocks, eating dry bread and horse meat that had been cured in salt, their hands wrapped in their wool cloaks to keep the blood from freezing in their veins. Orhan Sahib sat on a flat stone, a map of the province laid out before him, though there was no light to read it by. He did not need the ink. He had memorized every ridge, every stream, and every fortified house during the long nights of preparation in the south. He knew that Al-Aliuddin Sahib was a cautious man, one who would not commit his forces to a battle unless he was certain of victory. If they could capture Yaqid and Shahanshah before Al-Aliuddin Sahib could mobilize his main army, they might yet avoid a full-scale war that would drain their resources and leave them vulnerable to the deeper empires that waited on their eastern borders. "We have information from the scouts," Tamir Boga said, creeping into the shelter of the rock where Orhan Sahib sat. He was a veteran of the border wars, his skin like old leather, his nose broken by a mace blow that had nearly taken his life 10 years ago. "There is a force of nearly 800 men assembled at the old monastery of Zarkin, 3 miles from here. They are led by Kilal, Al-Aliuddin Sahib's younger brother. They have horses, and they are preparing to move toward the border to investigate the silence of the watchtower. They will find the tower empty," Orhan Sahib said, "and they will know we have crossed. We must strike them before they can form their ranks." "It is an ambush in the forest, then," Faladios said, his eyes shining in the dark. He had remained silent during the climb, his mind focused entirely on the prospect of finding Yaqid, of settling the debt that had remained unpaid since the massacre at the pass. He did not care about the politics of the border. He did not care about the caution of Al-Aliuddin Sahib. He wanted only the blood of the man who had ordered his family's slaughter, and he would ride through fire to get it. "Let me take the vanguard. If we catch them on the road between the monastery and the tower, we can cut them to pieces before they know they are under attack." Orhan Sahib looked at Faladios, recognizing the dangerous fire that burned within the man. It was a useful tool, but one that could easily consume the hand that wielded it if it was not guided with care. "You will have the vanguard, Faladios, but you will not charge until Orhan has blocked the retreat. We cannot afford to let a single man escape to carry the news of our strength to Al-Aliuddin Sahib's court." The descent began as the rain turned to a heavy, wet snow that clung to the branches and deadened the sound of their approach. They moved in 3 columns, Faladios leading the center along the main road, while Tarhan and Damir Khan took the ridges on either side to encircle the enemy force as it advanced through the narrow defile known as the Throat of Zarkin. It was a classic trap, one that required perfect timing and absolute coordination, and any mistake would allow the enemy to slip through and warn the larger garrisons further down the valley. As they reached the tree line, the sound of horses came to them from the road ahead, the jangle of bits, the soft thud of hooves on wet earth, and the low voices of men who had no idea that death was waiting for them in the white silence of the forest. The enemy was moving in a long, disorganized line, their spears held loosely on their shoulders, their banners furled against the wet snow. At their head rode Killil, a young man in polished iron armor that looked too clean for the dirty work of border warfare, his mount a fine white stallion that seemed ill-suited to the muddy trail. "Wait," Faladios whispered to his men, his hand resting on the neck of his horse to keep the beast quiet. The animal's ears were forward, its nostrils twitching as it caught the scent of the other horses. "Wait until the stallion passes the large oak." The line of enemy riders moved slowly, their progress hampered by the wet snow that had begun to accumulate on the trail. When Killil's horse reached the designated mark, Faladios rose in his stirrups, his sword clearing the scabbard with a sound that seemed to shatter the silence of the forest like a hammer on glass. "For the honor of the house," he roared, and the woods erupted with the thunder of 500 horses launching themselves down the slope. The initial impact was devastating. The enemy, caught completely unawares, had no time to form a line of defense or even to draw their weapons before the vanguard of Orhan Sahib's force was upon them. Faladios' sword found the neck of the first rider he reached, the steel cutting through leather and bone with a wet crunch that sprayed the white snow with crimson. His men followed him like a storm, their heavy mounts slamming into the smaller horses of the border guards, sending riders and beasts sprawling into the mud and the rocks. But Killil, despite his youth, was no coward. He managed to wheel his stallion around, his sword flashing in the dim light as he cut down a trooper who had lunged at his reins. "Stand!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and fury. "Form the circle, they are only raiders." His captains, veteran fighters like Jarkata Sahib and Mustafa, tried to rally the men, their voices rising above the din of the combat as they fought to establish a defensive perimeter around the young lord. But the trap had already closed. From the ridges above, Tarhan and Damir Khan led their columns down onto the flanks of the struggling column, their archers launching a hail of short-range arrows that found the gaps in the enemy's armor with deadly precision. The battle became a chaotic, close-quarters slaughter in the deep snow. The trees prevented any organized cavalry maneuvers, and soon the men were forced to dismount, fighting hand-to-hand with swords, axes, and daggers in the mud and the wet underbrush. The air was filled with the smell of sweat, wet wool, and the hot metallic tang of blood, the silence of the forest replaced by the screams of the wounded and the dull, heavy thuds of steel striking flesh and bone. Faladios moved through the press like a man possessed, his eyes searching every face for the features of Yakid, his sword describing a continuous arc of death that left a trail of bodies behind him. He did not care about the arrows that hissed through the branches around him. He did not care about the spear points that lunged at his chest, many of them turned aside only by the frantic shield work of the men who fought to keep pace with his advance. "Yakid," he cried, his voice hoarse from the effort of the combat. "Show yourself, coward, face the steel of the family you betrayed." But there was no sign of the traitor among the riders of Zarkin. Killil fought on, his white stallion now dead beneath him, his clean armor stained with mud and the blood of his own men. He was surrounded by a small circle of his personal guards, who fought with the desperation of men who knew that no mercy would be shown to them if they fell into the hands of the southern invaders. Orhan Sahib watched the battle from a low rise near the edge of the clearing, his face expressionless, his hand resting on his pommel. He did not join the fray. His task was to oversee the whole, to ensure that the encirclement remained unbroken, and to watch for any sign of reinforcements that might be moving toward the sound of the conflict from the monastery. Beside him stood Abdul Rahman, his face pale as he watched his former comrades in arms being cut down in the snow. "They are fighting well," Abdul Rahman said, his voice trembling slightly, "but they cannot hold against such numbers. Killil is a proud boy. He will not surrender while he still has a hand to hold a blade." "Pride is a luxury that only the living can afford," Orhan Sahib said. "If he does not yield within the next 10 minutes, see that Damir Khan brings up the heavy spearmen to finish it. We have no time to waste on honorable struggles." Even as he spoke, the balance of the fight shifted. Tarhan, having cleared the rear of the enemy column, led a fresh charge of 60 heavy infantrymen into the side of Killil's circle, their long spears lunging between the shields of the guards to find the soft flesh beneath. The young lord's defenders fell one by one, until only Killil and 2 of his captains remained, their backs against the trunk of a massive pine, their breath coming in ragged gasps that sounded like dry leaves scraping across stone. Faladios stepped forward from the press, his sword dripping, his face smeared with black mud and sweat. He looked at the young lord with a cold, dead gaze that made the boy's hand tremble on his hilt. "Where is Yakid?" Faladios demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me where he hides, and you may live to see your brother's court again. Lie to me, and your head will precede us to Al-Aliuddin Sahib's gates." Killil spat blood onto the snow, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I do not take orders from southern bandits. If you want Yakid, you must find him in the halls of my brother. He is guest there, under the protection of the Great Oath, and you will never reach him alive." "He has no protection here," Faladios said, and with a single, swift motion that defied the weariness of the combat, his blade swept forward, cutting through the young lord's guard and ending his defiance before the boy could even raise his shield to parry. The remaining two captains threw down their weapons at the sight of their commander's death, their spirits broken by the sudden, violent end of the young man they had been sworn to protect. The silence returned to the forest, heavier now, filled with the groans of the dying and the soft, dripping sound of blood falling from the branches onto the stained snow. "We have lost 64 men," Tarhan reported, his own left arm bandaged where a spear point had grazed the muscle, "and nearly 80 wounded who cannot travel at our pace. Killil's force is entirely destroyed, not a single rider escaped to the west." "Then the road to the monastery is open," Orhan Sahib said, dismounting and walking among the dead to inspect the quality of their gear. These were not simple border guards. Many of them wore chainmail of high quality and carried swords forged in the western cities, indicating that Al-Aliuddin Sahib had been preparing for war long before they had crossed the border. "We will occupy Zarkin before midday. We will turn it into our base of operations while we prepare the net for Yakid." The monastery of Zarkin was a fortress in all but name, its walls built of heavy fieldstone, its position on a high spur of rock commanding the entrance to the main valley of Al-Aliuddin Sahib's domain. When Orhan Sahib's vanguard arrived, they found the gates closed, but there were no soldiers on the battlements to defend them. The monks had fled into the mountains at the first sound of the battle in the forest, leaving behind empty cells, larders filled with winter provisions, and a cellar containing enough grain to feed Orhan Sahib's force for a month. It was here in the cold stone hall of the monastery that Orhan Sahib established his headquarters. The walls were decorated with ancient frescoes depicting the victories of forgotten kings, their paint peeling from the dampness, their eyes staring down at the southern warriors who now slept on the stone floors and cleaned their weapons in the light of tallow candles. "We have captured a messenger," Daimir Khan announced on the second day of their occupation. He brought forward a young boy, no older than 15, whose horse had been run down by the scouts near the western pass. "He carries letters from Al-Aliuddin Sahib to the governors of the western provinces. They are being summoned to bring their levies to the capital within 5 days." Orhan Sahib took the parchment, his fingers tracing the wax seal of the regional lord. The message was simple and urgent. "The southern wolf has crossed the river. Bring every man who can hold a spear. We will trap them in the high passes and end their line forever." "He knows we are here," Tarhan said, standing by the narrow window that looked out over the valley. "But he does not know our true strength. He believes we are merely a raider force sent to harass his borders while the main army prepares for a siege of his western strongholds." "Let him believe that," Orhan Sahib said. "We will use his confusion to draw his main force away from the capital. If we can tempt him into a battle in the open plains near the Red Willow, we can destroy his army before the western levies can arrive to reinforce him." "And what of Yakid?" Faladios asked, his voice coming from the shadows of the corner where he sat, his whetstone scraping against his blade with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. "Is he with the army, or does he remain in the safety of the palace?" "He is with the army," Abdul Rahman said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who knew the traitor's mind. "Yakid knows that if Al-Aliuddin Sahib is defeated, his own life is forfeit. He will not sit in the capital while the issue is decided in the field. He will be at Al-Aliuddin's right hand, directing his movements and trying to ensure that our forces are destroyed before we can reach the gates. Then we will give him the battle he desires," Orhan Sahib said, "but we will choose the ground and we will choose the time." The plan was set in motion over the next 3 days, a complex series of movements designed to deceive Al-Aliuddin Sahib into believing that Orhan Sahib's force was retreating toward the southern border. They abandoned the monastery of Zarkin, leaving behind a small garrison of 50 wounded men to hold the walls, while the main body of the army moved south along the high ridges, visible to the scouts who watched from the distant peaks. But as night fell on the third day, Orhan Sahib wheeled his column around. entering a deep, wooded valley that ran parallel to the main road, a place known as the Valley of the Silent Oak. It was a dark, narrow trench in the earth, its sides so steep that the sun only reached the bottom for 2 hours at midday, its floor covered in a dense growth of ancient oaks whose branches intertwined to form a solid canopy that excluded even the light of the stars. "This is where we will stand," Orhan Sahib told his captains as they gathered in the shelter of a limestone cave at the head of the valley. "The road through the valley is narrow, no more than 3 riders can move abreast. If Al-Aliaddin Sahib pursues us, his cavalry will be useless, and his numbers will work against him as his men crowd together in the bottleneck." "And if he does not pursue," Mahmud asked, "if he chooses to wait for us in the open plains where his numbers can be brought to bear?" "He will pursue," Orhan Sahib said, his voice carrying a cold certainty that left no room for doubt. "Because we have something he cannot ignore. We have his brother's body, and we have the banner of the Zarkan Guard. I have sent a messenger to his camp with Kilil's sword and a demand for tribute. A man of his pride cannot let such an insult pass without response. He will come, and he will come in anger." The provocation worked precisely as Orhan Sahib had calculated. On the 4th morning, the scouts reported that Al-Aliaddin Sahib had split his force, leaving 3,000 men to guard the capital while he led 4,000 of his best cavalry and infantry in rapid pursuit of the southern column. They were moving with a speed that suggested fury rather than caution, their banners flying, their commanders urging the men forward with promises of plunder and vengeance for the death of the young lord. By afternoon, the vanguard of the pursuing force had reached the entrance to the Valley of the Silent Oak. They paused at the mouth of the defile, their scouts peering into the dark shadows of the trees, but Orhan Sahib had prepared the ground with masterly care. There were no tracks, no abandoned gear, no sign that an army had passed this way, only the silent, ancient trees and the soft fall of the snow that had begun to cover the ground once more. "They are entering," Tarhan reported, slipping down from the ridge where he had been watching the road. "Yaqid is with them. He rides beside Al-Aliaddin Sahib's personal champion, a giant of a man named Zarkan who carries a 2-handed axe." "Faladios," Orhan Sahib said, his voice a low whisper in the white silence. "Your time has come. You will hold the center of the valley with the heavy infantry. Do not yield a single foot of ground until Tarhan has closed the entrance behind them." Faladios did not answer. He merely drew his sword, the steel reflecting the pale green light of the forest canopy, and stepped out onto the narrow trail, his men forming a solid wall of iron behind him, their shields locked, their spears projecting forward like the quills of a defensive beast. The encounter was sudden and violent. The vanguard of the pursuing cavalry rounded a bend in the trail, found themselves face to face with the wall of southern spears before they had time to draw their reins. The lead horses slammed into the iron points, their chests pierced, their riders thrown into the mud where they were quickly dispatched by the short swords of the infantry. "Ambush!" The cry went back through the line, but it was too late. The column was already committed to the narrow pass, and the pressure of the riders behind forced the front ranks forward into the killing zone despite the desperate efforts of their commanders to halt the advance. "Push them back!" Faladios roared, his sword hacking at the reins of a horse that had leaped onto his shield. "Let them see what happens to those who follow traitors." The battle in the valley became a nightmare of claustrophobic violence. There was no room for maneuver, no room for retreat, only the relentless, grinding pressure of 2 armies locked in a struggle for survival in a space no wider than a common road. The air was filled with the deafening roar of men fighting in a confined space, the sound of steel striking steel echoing off the limestone cliffs on either side, the smoke from the torches they had lit to see through the gloom hanging under the canopy of branches like a gray shroud. From his position on the ridge above, Orhan Sahib watched the struggle unfold, his mind calculating the timing of the final blow. He saw Al-Aliaddin Sahib's main force pressing into the valley, their ranks becoming increasingly disorganized as they tried to push through the bottleneck, their horses slipping on the wet clay and the bodies of the fallen. "Now," Orhan Sahib said to Damir Khan, who stood beside him with the signal horn, "sound the charge, let the mountains know we have arrived." The horn blew, 3 long, low notes that vibrated through the stone beneath their feet, and from both sides of the ridge the southern warriors descended like a landslide onto the flanks of the trapped column. They did not ride, they scrambled down the steep slopes on foot, using the trees to support their descent, their axes and short swords finding the backs and sides of the riders who could not turn their mounts in the narrow space. It was in this moment of supreme chaos that Faladios finally found the man he had sought through 3 weeks of blood and winter storm. Yaqid was near the center of the column, his mount dead, his armor dented and covered in the gray mud of the valley floor. He was fighting off 2 of Orhan Sahib's infantrymen with a desperation that showed he knew the price of capture, his sword moving in quick defensive circles that kept the attackers at bay. Yakid Faladios screamed, his voice cutting through the din of the battle like a clarion. The traitor turned, his eyes widening as he recognized the scarred face of the man who had pursued him from the ruins of his family's home. He did not run, there was nowhere to run. He drew his dagger with his left hand, his sword held low in his right, his body adopting the low, crouched stance of a master of the duel. Faladios, Yakid said, his breath coming in short, white puffs. You should have stayed in the south. Your bones will look no different from the rocks of this valley when the wolves are finished with them. They will be clean, Faladios said, and with a roar that had no human quality left in it, he launched himself forward, his heavy sword descending in a blow that would have split a stone. Yakid parried the impact of the steel, sending a jar through his arms that nearly made him drop his weapon, but he was quicker than Faladios had anticipated. He slipped under the follow-up blow, his dagger lunging at the gap in Faladios's mail beneath the armpit, the point grazing the ribs and drawing a thin line of red that soaked into the wool of the undergarment. But Faladios did not feel the pain, his mind had closed to everything but the necessity of destruction. He used his shield as a hammer, slamming the heavy iron rim into Yakid's face, shattering the nose and sending the traitor sprawling into the wet clay. Yakid tried to rise, his face a mask of blood and mud, but Faladios was upon him before he could find his footing. The heavy boot came down on the traitor's sword hand, the bones cracking under the pressure, while the point of Faladios's blade came to rest against the hollow of Yakid's throat. The battle around them seemed to fade into a distant murmur as the two men stared at each other, the one who had betrayed everything and the one who had lost everything to that betrayal. For my brother, Faladios said, his voice flat and cold. For his son, for the honor of the line you thought you had destroyed. Wait, Yakid gasped, his eyes wild with the sudden, terrifying realization that there was no escape, no clever turn of phrase, no promise of gold that could buy his life in this dark place. Shahanshah, he has the treaty, he has the gold from the Eastern Lords, I can show you where it is. You have nothing, Faladios said, and with a single, deliberate thrust, he drove the blade home, ending the traitor's life and the long, bitter chase that had consumed them both since the fall of Kalandar. The death of Yakid seemed to signal the collapse of Al-Aliuddin Sahib's remaining resolve. His champion Zarkin had already fallen to Turhan's blade, his body lying under the wheels of an abandoned supply wagon, and Al-Aliuddin Sahib himself had been wounded in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The remaining border guards, seeing their commanders dead or disabled and their retreat blocked by the columns of Turhan and Damir Khan, began to throw down their weapons, their cries for mercy rising above the sound of the falling snow. Orhan Sahib descended from the ridge, his boots sinking into the bloody mud of the trail, his face expressionless as he surveyed the field of victory. It was a complete destruction. Nearly 2,000 of the enemy lay dead in the valley, their bodies already turning stiff in the freezing air, while the remaining 2,000 were disarmed and gathered into tight groups under the watchful eyes of the southern spearmen. We have taken Al-Aliuddin Sahib, Turhan said, leading forward the regional lord, whose hands were bound with a heavy leather cord. He was pale from blood loss, his rich wool cloak torn and stained with grease and mud, his eyes fixed on the ground as if he could not bear to look at the man who had destroyed his army in a single afternoon. You have entered my lands without right, Al-Aliuddin Sahib said, his voice weak but still carrying the pride of his office. You have slaughtered my men and my brother. The High Court will not support this outrage. Rulers from the West will march against you, and your name will be cursed as a thief and an assassin. Your court has no ears to hear your complaints, Orhan Sahib said, his voice cold and flat as the ice that had begun to form on the branches above. Your brother died because he stood between me and justice. You are alive because you still have a purpose to serve. You will write a letter to the governors of your western provinces, ordering them to halt their march and lay down their arms. You will surrender your capital to my forces, and you will pay a tribute of 40,000 gold pieces to cover the cost of this campaign. And if I refuse, Al-Aliuddin Sahib asked, his teeth chattering from the cold and the pain of his wound. Then your capital will burn as Kalandar burned, Orhan Sahib said, and your line will end with you. The choice is yours, Lord of the Red Willow, but make it quickly. My men are cold and they have little patience left for those who delay their rest. The regional lord looked at the bodies of his men, at the silent, blood-stained forest, and at the cold, hard eyes of the commander who stood before him. He knew that Orhan Sahib did not lie. He had seen the ruins of Kalandar, and he knew that this southern wolf would hesitate at nothing to secure his authority. I will write, Al-Alaeddin Sahib said, his head bowing in final, complete submission. The campaign seemed to have reached its conclusion, the enemy destroyed, the traitor dead, and the regional lord forced to yield his lands and his gold to the victor. But as Orhan Sahib stood in the courtyard of the monastery of Zarkin that night, watching the snow cover the graves of the men they had buried in the frozen earth, his heart was not at ease. Tarhan approached him from the darkness of the cloisters, his heavy cloak white with the falling snow, his face carrying an expression that Orhan Sahib had learned to fear more than any report of enemy movements. "What is it?" Orhan Sahib asked. "Our scouts have returned from the western pass," Tarhan said, his voice a low whisper that was lost in the sigh of the wind through the pines. "They did not find the western Levi's, they found something else, an army from the great empire of the east, 10,000 strong under the banner of the Grand Vizier. They have already crossed the frontier and they are marching toward our position." Orhan Sahib looked out over the dark valley, where the fires of his camp blinked in the white silence of the snow. The realization came to him then, cold and heavy as the iron of his sword. The war was not over. It had barely begun. The fall of Kalamdar, the death of Yaqid, the submission of Al-Alaeddin Sahib, these were merely the opening moves in a larger, more terrible game that would consume the entire north before the spring could return to these cursed hills. "Prepare the men," Orhan Sahib said, his hand resting on his grandfather's sword. "We march at dawn. We must reach the pass before they can block our retreat. If we must fight an empire, we will do so on ground of our own choosing." The column began to move before the first light of day, a long, silent line of black figures moving through the white wilderness, their faces turned toward the high peaks where the storm was gathering, their hearts filled with the grim knowledge that their journey had no end in sight, and that the road they traveled would be written in blood until the final, distant accounting of their line. Smoke still lived in the stones of Kalamdar, as if the fortress itself had inhaled fire and could not yet learn how to exhale it into silence. Even after the last corpse had been dragged into pits, even after the ash had been scraped from archways where men had once laughed too loudly, the night air carried the bitter taste of charred grain and singed wool. Orhan Sahib walked those corridors with his cloak drawn tight against the smell, and he did not pretend that victory was light. The war had merely moved like a wolf that waits in shade. It had not ended because one tyrant had fallen. The tyrant's shadow would seek new feet. On the first morning after Shahanshah's death, Orhan summoned the captains who had remained loyal enough to stand close when others avoided their gaze. Daimir Khan came with soot on his beard, as if he had spent the night swallowing the smoke himself. Mahmud arrived late, his truce breath still hanging in his memory, and his eyes kept searching Orhan's face for signs that hospitality could still be a door rather than a trap. Orhan stood with the calm posture of a man who had never needed speeches to measure danger. Faladios paced behind Orhan like a blade waiting to be drawn, his jaw tight, his grief shaped into discipline. Abdul Rahman was brought as well, alive, because he had chosen the side of truth before truth had become only a weapon. "Tell me what you saw in the tyrant's chambers," Orhan said to Abdul Rahman, voice low, each word placed like a stone on a grave. Abdul Rahman bowed his head. "I saw fear taught as law. I saw parchment stained with blood because ink was cheaper than courage. I saw men who smiled while their eyes counted execution dates. And I saw how Yaqid kept his shadow separate from the others. He was loyal only to his own blade, and he served Shahanshah as a man serves a ladder, until the climb is done and then he kicks the ladder away." Orhan listened without flinching, though inside him anger moved like fire seeking dry wood. He understood now that the escape of Yaqid had not been accident. It had been preparation. A criminal's mind does not merely run, it turns the road into a map for returning knives. "Where did he go?" Orhan asked. Abdul Rahman hesitated. Then he spoke as one who breaks a vow only because the vow demanded it. "Toward the southern road, not openly." A small company led by Kulad slipped out through a postern while the rebels fought in the courtyard. They had a promise from Malik Alaeddin, peace for refugees and silence for fugitives. Yaqid carried more than a sword. He carried names. He carried debts. He carried the anger of men who had surrendered to survive. Tarhan's gaze sharpened. Then the neutral lord is not neutral in his heart. Orhan's hand tightened on the edge of the map spread upon the table. The parchment lay scarred where fingers had pressed too hard. "Neutrality is a cloak. A cloak can hide virtue, but it can also hide a dagger. We will not assume which one it is until we touch it." That day Orhan appointed order where chaos had been. He set Daimir Khan to manage the outer gates and storehouses, not because he trusted him blindly, but because Daimir had already learned that loyalty must be fed like soldiers, daily, insistently, without pause. Mustafa was named captain of patrols, and Al-Alaeddin Sahib was assigned to coordinate watch on the eastern ridge where Old Stone held cold wind. Zarkin and Kulads were commanded to rebuild the broken stairways and clear the tunnel entrances beneath the armory, for even victories leave hungry mouths of stone that can swallow another army if left unexamined. Faladios did not ask to manage anything, he only asked for the road. "By the grave of my brother's house," he said, stepping closer until the firelight caught the scar on his cheek, "I will not end this war with a fortress conquered and a murderer roaming." Orhan turned his face toward him, and Tarhan saw how Orhan's eyes did not soften even when grief rose. "Justice first. Vengeance must serve it. If you chase Yakid like a wounded dog, you will lose what you gain. If you chase him like a commander, you will drag him into the light where oaths become knives for his own throat." Faladios spat once into the dust, "And if the Lord who hides him believes he can delay judgment with paperwork and prayers, then we will answer with steel and mercy," Orhan said, "for mercy is only the other side of justice." They found the first trail in the afternoon, not with chains of magic, but with the honest labor of eyes. A line of broken reeds by a stream, footprints too fresh to be old, and a smear of tallow on bark where a torch had been wrapped and then unwrapped in haste. The men had moved like those who know the land's secrets, quick steps, minimal weight, no wandering. They had also moved like those who feared pursuit. Someone had ridden ahead to secure a path of hiding. Orhan sent Tamir Boga with a small detachment toward the marsh where old reeds grew thick and silent. He sent Kilal and Jarkata Saheb to check the broken road toward the southern gate. Mustafa remained with the main column, and Tarhan stayed close, his attention constant, his fingers always near his bowstring even while walking. "History teaches that criminals travel with two shadows," Tarhan murmured beside Orhan as evening cooled the stones. "One is their fear, the other is their plan." Orhan nodded. "Then we will cut both." Night came early, as it always does in lands where mountains guard the horizon. The army moved in single file along a ridge where pine and cedar held their darkness like locked doors. In those forests, the world becomes narrower. The sound of your own breathing, the creak of leather, the distant rhythm of another man's fear. Orhan believed in silence not as absence of sound, but as presence of attention. Then arrows came from nowhere men could point to after. A hiss, a thud, the brief cry of a rider who fell as if he had been picked up by invisible hands and placed upon the earth. Smoke rose from a brazier that had no right to burn so far from the camp, and the darkness thickened around it like cloth around a wound. Tarhan swung into motion, pulling Orhan back a half step, not because Orhan feared arrows, but because Tarhan feared consequences. "Close," he snapped. Men surged forward, shields raised, and for a moment the forest became a battlefield of cramped geometry. Trees stole space from warriors, forcing them into angles where swords met shoulders and elbows found ribs. Steel rang against steel with the bright cruelty of truth. Faladios arrived at the front of that chaos like a storm that had been summoned by oath. "Hold the line," he bellowed, voice tearing through branches as if they were curtains. It should have been easy for archers to kill from cover, but the men who shot had not counted on Faladios' patience with pain. He met the first ambusher at arm's length, not giving him time to draw again. His sword moved once, clean, decisive, and the man's weapon clattered into fern. Another followed, and another, each one driven into desperation by the realization that death was no longer distant. Orhan watched the duel of blades not as entertainment, but as revelation. Yakid's men did not fight like hired soldiers. They fought like men defending a secret passage, guarding a route they believed would stay open if enough blood delayed the pursuers. That meant Yakid had already laid out the next step of his escape. The question was whether Orhan had stepped onto Yakid's next stage. A messenger arrived near midnight, stumbling, his cloak torn. It was not one of their own. He was a local runner, a man who had traded grain for rumors and survived by selling what others feared to speak. His voice shook as he spoke to Orhan. "Malik Aliuddin's riders, there are many camped by the river where the stones are black," the man said. "They ask for refugees. They say they will not harm those who surrender. But when they take a man, their faces remain calm while his shadow is removed from the world." Orhan lowered his gaze. The forest around them breathed cold. "By Allah," Tarhan whispered, "this is no neutrality. This is a marketplace for murder." Orhan did not answer quickly. He studied the distance between trees, the possibility of flanking, the likely positions of horsemen in the dark. Then he gave orders that sounded almost merciful because they would cost fewer lives than a frontal assault and because mercy, like steel, has its own sharpness. "Tamir Boga will strike the camp's rear," Orhan said. "Mustafa will hold the ridge and prevent their escape by the water. Faladios," Orhan's eyes narrowed toward the Black River's direction. "Faladios will lead the first charge, but he will not chase individuals. He will break the line and seize the riders' banners. If we remove their order, we remove their cruelty." Faladios' mouth tightened as if swallowing a prayer. "I swear it." As they moved toward the river, the sky cleared for a moment and stars appeared like cold witness eyes. Then the stars disappeared under cloud again and night resumed its work. The camp by the river was a staging ground disguised as a sanctuary. Torches burned in ring patterns. Refuge tents stood like pale questions, and in the center, riders watched with hands near weapons, ready to claim that they had not known what they were doing. When Tarhan signaled, the attack began without trumpet. It began with smoke, a bundle of resin torched by men who knew how to keep fire from warning too much, and then the night was filled with the smell of burning pitch, thickening air so men coughed and blinked and forgot to aim. By the Most High, Orhan called softly to himself, but loud enough that nearby captains heard the invocation as a binding. We do not come to steal, we come to end theft of lives. Palladios rode into the torchlight like an avenging figure painted by history itself. He shattered the front guard with a fury that left no time for careful resistance. Men swung spears and axes with panic because panic is contagious. Then close quarters fighting rose again, because what are wars but the forced meeting of bodies that were never meant to touch so intimately? Steel flashed, a rider fell, another stumbled under a shield and then died under a blade that did not pause. Orhan moved between trees and tents, directing his men with gestures rather than shouts because he understood that orders spoken loudly could be heard by the wrong ears. He had learned that Yakid's true talent was not killing, his true talent was listening. In the chaos, someone emerged from the side of the camp, a man in a cleaner cloak than the rest, a man whose posture declared authority even when he ran. His eyes found Orhan. His mouth tightened as if tasting regret. Then he spoke a name. Yakid will remember this. Tarhan's ears caught the tone. He's not Malik's commander, he said. Orhan's mind struck like a hammer. No, he's an envoy, and envoys mean plans. Palladios drove forward, pushing back guards near the river's edge. Mustafa swept around with men who knew how to cut off retreat routes. Damir Khan's patrols held the ridge above, preventing an escape into the hills. By dawn, the camp's organization was dead. Refuge tents were torn open not with cruelty, but with urgency, searching for missing men, freeing those who had been held like coins waiting for payment. Yet Yakid was not found among the rescued. A prisoner captured during the fight, an exhausted man with wrists raw from ropes, was brought before Orhan. He stared at the ground until Orhan demanded truth with silence rather than voice. You know where he is, Orhan said. Say it, or your tongue will pay after your sword is taken. The prisoner swallowed. Yakid left before the fire. He used smoke as cover. He promised Malik Aliadin safe passage for the refugees, promised him gold and wives and sons spared. But he did not promise Malik truth. Malik believed him. Orhan felt the anger rise, not as heat but as clarity. Then we must speak directly to Malik Aliadin, he said, and we must do it in a way that removes Malik's comfort. A messenger went to Aliadin's camp arrangements near dawn with terms of honor delivered like threats. Orhan did not insult Malik openly. He respected the shape of diplomacy, because diplomacy is a weapon that does not show blood until it has already done damage. A banner of truce was raised again, and Mahmud was sent because Mahmud's previous role at Kalamdar carried authority among those who worship custom. Mahmud approached with short words. He was not a man who wasted syllables. Orhan Sahib honors the hospitality of lords, Mahmud said. We ask that Yakid be delivered to the justice he has earned. If Malik Aliadin refuses, Orhan Sahib will consider it not sanctuary but complicity. Aliadin's voice came back from behind a line of guards. It was calm, the calm of someone who believes his calm will become armor. Tell your commander that I guard refugees. I do not know where Yakid hides. Orhan's patience was tested not by Aliadin's denial, but by the certainty that Aliadin had spoken the denial because he feared what it would cost to tell truth. Orhan understood that the man might be cornered, but a cornered man bites. Yet Yakid was the bite's teeth, and Orhan could not allow the criminal's plan to grow teeth inside Aliadin's territory. That night, as their scouts moved in the woods, Tarhan caught an unusual sound, a quiet clink too deliberate to be armor settling. It came from a small procession hidden among the pines, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. Men moved carefully, not like soldiers marching to battle, but like thieves moving stolen grain. Tarhan signaled, and Orhan's unit formed an ambush of their own, not open traps with obvious stakes and ropes. This was a trap made of patience. Arrows waited in quivers. Swords rested half-drawn so hands would not tremble when the moment came. Then the procession passed into a clearing, and the torchlight revealed the truth. They were exchanging refugees for coin with Aliadin's men, bargaining as if souls were cattle. Among them, there were symbols, knots and rings that Orhan recognized from Abdul Rahman's memories as markers of Yakid's network. And there, near the bundles, Yakid's courier stood, a man with a scar beneath the chin and a calm expression that belonged not to ignorance but to authority. He looked toward the tree line and smiled slightly as if he sensed eyes before they belonged to him. Orhan's heart tightened. He planned for us to find this, he murmured. Tarhan answered without turning, then his escape is already being written. We must refuse to read it. They struck at once. A volley of arrows tore through the clearing. Men screamed, not only from pain but from the humiliation of being caught mid-bargain. Close quarters chaos followed immediately because those who are surprised must fight to regain control of their bodies. In that smoke and steel, a voice rose sharply in command. Do not scatter, keep the bundles. Tarhan lunged toward the voice, and so did Faladios. They met resistance at once, men who fought too tightly together, trained in a manner that proved they were not ordinary auxiliaries. One of them carried a curved blade with a pattern of engravings on the spine, and as he swung, its motion looked practiced like a prayer learned by heart. Then a shadow moved backward, stepping toward the deepest part of the clearing where the trees formed a natural corridor. It was not fast retreat, it was measured retreat, like a man leading a hunt, and Orhan recognized the gait. He had seen it before in the stories spoken by prisoners, in the images Abdul Rahman described with a trembling hand. Yakid himself had arrived. His cloak was dark, almost blacker than the forest night. His beard was trimmed. His eyes were alert and burning, as if he had slept little and plotted more. He stood beyond the first line of fighting, not fully engaged, watching like a commander who had already decided the battle's story and only needed bodies to act out their parts. Faladios broke into a run toward him, and Tarhan followed half a step behind, sword angled not for conquest but for control. Orhan held back for one heartbeat because he understood that duels are never only duels. Duels are messages to armies. Yakid lifted his hands slightly, palms visible. Commander Faladios, he said, voice carrying through the clang, your rage has traveled far. You should have stayed with your fortress. You would have died with honor among stones. Faladios did not answer with negotiation. He answered with oath. By the mercy Allah grants to those who uphold justice, I will not leave this forest until you feel the weight of what you have done. Yakid smiled like a man who had already counted the odds. Justice, he echoed. You name justice while you burn and cut and hunt. You speak of honor while your hands hide in tunnels. Orhan's jaw tightened at the accusation, not because it was persuasive, but because it was bait. Yakid wanted words, wanted doubt to seed between the men who followed Faladios. If he could make Faladios question Orhan's intentions, he could weaken their unity. And unity, Orhan knew, was the true fortress within every army. Faladios stepped forward anyway. His sword came out with a sound like thunder being restrained. Speak no more. The duel began. At first it was not spectacle but survival. Each man probed, testing distance among trees that refused to make space for a clean fight. Yakid's blade moved with economy, turning his body as if he were always aware of angles. Faladios' sword moved like a confession, violent, direct, refusing to accept the other man's rhythm. They struck, metal ringing against metal, and sparks flashed briefly like lightning trapped in leaves. Then Yakid feinted high and struck low, aiming for the joint where Faladios' guard would not be perfect. Faladios adjusted, too fast for most men, and the blow missed by the width of a breath. But in that moment, Yakid shifted again, stepping sideways while his cloak fluttered, concealing the movement of his other hand. Tarhan saw at first a small motion toward his belt, a quick draw of a knife, not to win in strength but to win in treachery. Tarhan surged forward to intercept, but Yakid's eyes flicked toward Orhan, and Yakid's knife jerked toward a nearby soldier instead of toward Tarhan. Fall back, Orhan snapped. The soldier stumbled anyway, and the knife missed him by a hair. Yakid had not tried to kill, he had tried to create panic. He tried to make Faladios' mind break rhythm. Faladios' face hardened. You fight with fear. I fight with consequence, Yakid answered. Fear keeps men alive, men who do not fear die first. Faladios drove forward, pressing Yakid against a tree. The trunk caught the edge of steel and rang as if the forest itself had been struck. Yakid twisted free, then struck again, harder now, and Faladios staggered a step, his shoulder taking a glancing blow. Blood began to seep beneath his sleeve. Orhan watched without moving. He did not rush to steal the duel from its proper battlefield, because he knew the men needed to see justice as something more than an order. It needed to feel like a truth carved in front of them. Then Yakid stepped back, raising his voice. Orhan Sahib, he called, as if speaking to a council of kings rather than a forest drenched in battle. I offer you a choice. Let me live, and I will show you the names of all your traitors. The forest shuddered with the sound of that sentence because it carried a world of poison. If Orhan believed it, his army would fracture. If he rejected it without thought, Yakid's network might already be moving. Orhan's mouth opened, and for a heartbeat the words inside him were not for Yakid, but for Allah. Then he answered in a voice so steady that it became heavier than steel. Names are not the power you think they are, Orhan said. Justice does not require threats. Justice requires execution. Yakid's eyes flared. Faladios struck then with a sudden, furious motion, an overhead cut aimed not to block but to end. Yakid spun away, but his boot slipped on wet earth, and for a heartbeat his balance betrayed him. That heartbeat belonged to Faladios. The duel's climax came in close quarters, no room for grand swings. Faladios pressed his forehead forward, almost head-to-head, and drove his blade across Yakid's guard into the gap of his armor. Yakid gasped, a sound like a bell cracked and still ringing. Faladios withdrew his sword and then thrust again, not for show but for certainty. Yakid stumbled backward, catching himself against a tree. For a moment his eyes looked beyond Faladios as if expecting salvation from the darkness. Then Yakid laughed once harsh, "You think you have ended me." Orhan charged now, sword up, to prevent any trick, but Yakid moved his hand in a final motion and a pulse of smoke bloomed from a pouch at his feet. It was not magic. It was fire stink powder, quick and suffocating, meant to blind and separate. Men coughed. Orhan turned his head, shielding his mouth with cloth. Faladios swung once through the fog, searching, and his blade met something, flesh or leather, he could not tell. When the smoke thinned, Yakid was gone. Not dead, not captured, gone. The duel had become a lesson. Even justice in a battlefield of steel can be delayed by a criminal's prepared escape. Faladios sank to one knee, breathing hard, blood staining the ground where he had knelt, as if praying for a victory his hands had earned but not fully claimed. Orhan approached. He did not comfort with sweet words, he comforted with duty. He fled, Orhan said. Faladios's voice broke like a weapon dropped too soon. He bled. Orhan nodded. A wound is not an ending, it is a path, follow it. They searched the forest with a brutality that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with necessity. They tracked blood on leaves and resin on branches where a body had grabbed for balance. They found scraps of cloak thread, and then a dark pool near a stream where Yakid had washed his blade and tried to erase his trail. But Yakid was not merely injured, he was thinking. He had left hints that would guide pursuers into traps, because criminals who cannot win the duel will try to win the aftermath. And so Orhan found the first sign of that trap when he returned from a creek, his face pale. There are footprints ahead, he said, but they do not match Yakid's stride. These are lighter, these are women's boots. Orhan's body tightened. Why would he use women's boots? To draw us, Orhan answered, to make you hesitate, to make Faladios slow down to avoid harming refugees. He wants us to commit moral delay. Faladios rose, anger rising again like flame. Then we will commit justice faster than his manipulation can reach us. Orhan grabbed his arm, restraining him not out of fear but out of command. No, he said, we will not become the excuse criminals need. We will check, we will verify. They discovered that the trap was half true. 2 women refugees were indeed present near a hidden camp, their boots replaced with older ones to disguise tracks. They were not the bait alone, they were victims caught by Yakid's demands. When Orhan asked through gestures and careful words, the women pointed toward a direction and shook their heads, eyes full of terror. Yakid had forced them to guide him, he said, because his wound needed care from someone who could bind it without attracting guards. The women spoke of an old healer named Altadin Sahib, living in a small hut near the stone ridge. They said Yakid had arrived at dusk, pale and shaking, and had offered gold and threats both. Then he had ordered them to lie, that they had fled from the forest fire without knowing anything else. Orhan listened and tasted the cold truth. Yakid had not only fled, he had recruited compassion to disguise his cruelty. Find the healer, Orhan ordered, but do not seize him blindly, we will question him first. Altadin Sahib was found by dawn, half hidden behind boulders, his hands stained from herbs. When he saw Orhan's men, he tried to speak with dignity, but fear had already tightened his throat. I treat the wounded, he said. Orhan's voice sharpened. And did you treat Yakid? The healer's eyes flicked toward the left, toward a cave mouth where steam rose faintly from a hidden fire. "He came," Altadin Sahib whispered. "He came with a blade wound and a promise that if I spoke, his men would return with knives. I did not want." Orhan stepped closer. "He will return only when the hunt is wrong. If you speak now, you live. If you hide now, you become part of the crime." The healer's shoulders sagged. He pointed. "He is not in the hut. He is inside the stone cavity toward the back. He told me to seal the entrance and keep others away." Tarhan approached the cave mouth. He pressed his ear to stone, listening for breath, for movement. Then he signaled. Smoke rose from the cave's interior where someone had lit a small burner to keep bandages from drying. There was life in there, life that had used fear to keep it hidden. Orhan ordered a siege without walls. He told Mustafa to bring torches soaked with resin, but not to burn immediately. He told Zarkin and Jarkata Sahib to take positions on both sides, ready to close any exit. He told Damir Khan to secure the ridge so no reinforcements from Aliuddin's territory could slip in unnoticed. Then he faced the cave. "Yakid," Orhan called, voice carrying through the stone. "Your smoke has failed, your duel has failed. Now face what you have earned." Inside, silence stretched. Then a muffled voice answered, calm like a blade being cleaned. "You came with justice, Orhan Sahib?" Yakid asked. "Then you will see that justice has limits. Inside that cave is not only my flesh. Inside is a letter to Malik Aliuddin, a letter that will prove his neutrality was a purchase." Orhan felt the trap's edges tighten. Yakid was trying to turn Orhan into a messenger, trying to shift priorities. If Aliuddin's neutrality collapsed publicly, he would become enemy even to those who had supported him. Yakid wanted to ignite factions, not only escape. "You would burn your own cause to save your life," Faladios spat from behind Orhan, his bandaged shoulder bleeding through cloth. Yakid's voice came again, louder. "I would burn your cause to save my future. Faladios, you fight like a man who believes the world is a courtroom, but the world is a battlefield. There is no mercy here unless it is demanded by strength." Tarhan's blade angled toward the cave mouth. "Enough words." Orhan held up his hand. "No," he said. "Words are evidence. Evidence can be used. If Aliuddin is complicit, he should not hide behind honor." He signaled Mustafa and the resin-soaked torches were set at the cave entrance. Fire held just at the boundary, not yet consuming but forcing the cave's air to change. Smoke began to seep outward. Heat made the stones sweat. Men inside began to move, coughing, shifting. A figure staggered toward the exit, but not alone. Two armed men emerged, trying to cover Yakid's retreat. Their eyes were wild, as if they had expected fire but not urgency. Faladios charged. One of the armed men swung a curved blade and Faladios met it with a hard block. The swords screamed against each other, sparks snapping in the air like angry birds. The other man rushed from the side and tried to seize Faladios's unguarded flank. Orhan moved then, stepping in with a strike meant not to kill but to unbalance. His blade kissed the man's ribs and sent him stumbling. Tarhan finished him quickly because Tarhan did not waste motion. Yakid emerged last, cloaked in smoke, his face pale and tight with pain. Blood clung to his sleeve where Faladios had struck earlier, yet his eyes remained sharp, cunning, alive. He stared at Orhan. "You think fire brings truth?" "No," Orhan answered. "Fire brings confession." Yakid's lips curled. "Then you will confess something too." Before anyone could move, Yakid threw a small pouch onto the ground. It burst, releasing a cloud so thick it swallowed sound. The smoke did not just blind, it carried a bitter taste that made eyes water and lungs burn. Men stumbled, hands flailing. In that sudden chaos, Yakid stepped sideways into a shadow corridor, the one the healer's cave had concealed. He could go now because he had prepared this escape before Orhan arrived. He had planned even his capture's possibility. Faladios lunged after him, but his bandage tore and his shoulder screamed. Tarhan caught him, restraining him with a grip like iron. "Wait," Tarhan said. "He's moving to the ridge. That means he has an exit behind the ridge stones." Orhan looked where Yakid vanished. He understood immediately. A man who expects pursuit always leaves a second road. "Jarkata Sahib," Orhan called, "to the ridge's far side. Killil with Zarkin take the narrow pass. Damir Khan block the western approach to Aliuddin's camp. If we chase him in the forest forever, we will never finish the war." The hunt split, men vanished into shadows. Orhan stood breathing through cloth, eyes stinging, and he felt the weight of an unanswered question press into his skull. If Yakid could escape again, what other traps had he built around other roads, other leaders, other loyalties? Yakid's footsteps led to the ridge where stone rose like a broken spine. The air there was thinner, the smoke easier to see turning into a veil. Orhan's eyes caught movement, Yakid limping, one hand clutched to his side. He was bleeding, but he moved with stubborn intent. Faladios arrived onto the ridge a moment later, face twisted in pain, sword held high like a vow. Orhan stood with him, eyes scanning for flanking angles. In the gray dawn light, they saw Yakid stop and turn, as if waiting. Now Yakid said, "You will end your rage here on this stone." Faladios took one step, then another, but he swayed. Orhan steadied him. "Commander," Orhan said quietly, his posture is too calm, he wants the fight to begin. Faladios' voice was raw, "Then let him want it." This time the duel was faster, more desperate, because they fought among stones that offered little room and because Faladios' wound would not allow long endurance. Yakid struck first, aiming for the collar where a blade could cut bone. Faladios twisted and blocked, his sword scraping sparks from the air. Yakid's second strike came low, a hook intended to draw blood from the leg to slow movement. Faladios kicked hard, driving his boot into Yakid's ankle. Pain flashed in Yakid's face. For a heartbeat, his guard faltered. Then Yakid smiled. In that smile was the truth of criminals. Even pain cannot erase their final plan. He had not come to merely fight. He had come to lure Faladios into a position where Orhan's men would be forced to choose between ending the duel and preventing a larger disaster. A whistle cut through the stone air. From below the ridge, horns sounded, several at once. Not Orhan's horns, not a simple warning. It was a coordinated call that meant Malik Aliuddin's forces had moved, that an ambush had begun elsewhere, and that the distraction of this ridge duel was the hook. Orhan's mind snapped into tactical vision. He looked toward the smoke's direction, toward where Damir Khan's block should have held. He could sense the battle's shift even before scouts arrived. "Enough," Orhan said, stepping between Faladios and Yakid. "He is not your only enemy." Yakid's eyes narrowed, surprised by this interruption. "You want to stop the duel now, after all your oaths?" "I have sworn to justice, not to pride," Orhan replied. "Your wound gives you only so much life, your escape gives you only so much time, but your horn gives me a bigger threat. Where I must stand, I will stand." He signaled Orhan, "Hold him, not by steel alone, by witness." Then Orhan did something that enraged criminals and disciplined soldiers alike. He raised a banner toward the ridge's lower slope where scouts could see and where Malik Aliuddin's men would also see. It was a standard of Kalimdar's captured emblem, displayed openly. "Those who follow Malik Aliuddin," Orhan called out, voice carrying across stone and mist, "know this, your neutrality is a costume. Yakid has been hunted since Shahanshah fell. If you shelter him, you become his accomplices. If you deliver him now, your honor will be measured differently." The words were strategy and psychological warfare at once. If Aliuddin's men believed they were being dragged into someone else's conflict, they might hesitate. If they feared exposure, they might choose self-preservation. Yakid had relied on betrayal's secrecy. Orhan would instead weaponize daylight. Below, boots thundered. A force moved into position, and in that movement, Orhan saw Malik Aliuddin's discipline, heavy shields, arranged archers, and a commander with a clean posture, one who believed he could redirect the war with a single decision. "Malik Aliuddin himself," Orhan whispered. Yakid laughed again, a sound full of strain. "You see, justice is not in your hands, Orhan Sahib. It is in the hands of lords who decide what truth they can afford." Orhan's voice hardened, "And truth will cost you whether you can afford it or not." Arrows began to fly from the lower slope, aimed not only at Yakid but at Orhan's position. It was meant to kill the commander first, to make the chase collapse into panic. Orhan moved, lifting his shield to intercept arrows that would have found Orhan's ribs. Faladios advanced one step to help, despite his wound, because loyalty to justice does not permit retreat when duty has been chosen. Then a new sound cut through the air, steel on steel, close and urgent from the western side. Orhan's eyes snapped toward it. Jarkata Sahib's unit, Kilal, Zarkin, they had encountered something unexpected. A rider came up, panting, head bowed. "Commander," the rider said, voice trembling with urgency, "Aliuddin Sahib's men, they moved ahead of our block. They opened a pass that should have stayed sealed. They captured 2 of our scouts and left them alive to send a message. Orhan understood immediately with a cold clarity. This was not merely Malik al-Yadin's battlefield tactic. This was internal corrosion. It meant someone among Orhan's extended circle, someone close enough to know Roots, had been bribed or coerced. Abdul Rahman's earlier warnings returned like a curse: fear trained as law, paranoia used as rope, betrayal embedded where it could not be seen. Orhan turned his gaze toward the ridge's lower slope. In the distance, Malik al-Yadin's banner fluttered. Beside it, Orhan saw a smaller standard, unfamiliar in pattern but carried by a man whose walk he recognized from earlier intelligence, Mustafa's subcaptain, once trusted, now moving with unnatural calm. "Mustafa," Orhan called. Mustafa looked up, confused for a heartbeat. Then his face tightened, not with surprise but with resignation, like a man realizing the end of a road he had denied. "Commander," Mustafa said carefully, "I swear." Yakid's laughter rose again behind them, and Orhan realized the worst of it. Yakid had not escaped only to evade justice. He had escaped to trigger the next betrayal, to scatter the army's attention, to force Orhan to fight on 2 fronts while the criminal's name remained a knife behind the curtain. Orhan's eyes burned with understanding. "He wanted this," he said. "He wanted you to discover it mid-hunt." Orhan breathed in smoke-stung air and felt the war inside his chest sharpen. He could not chase Yakid alone anymore, not with arrows and horns and internal doubts surrounding him like wolves closing their circle. Yet he also could not allow Yakid to vanish again and rebuild in safety. He made a decision that tasted like iron. Orhan said, "Keep Faladios on his feet. If he falls, the men will follow his rage, not the command. Damir Khan, report immediately to the Western Bloc. If Al-Yadin Sahib's pass is open, we close it with fire, not a fire that spreads into friendly farms, only into the mouth of the betrayal." Faladios swallowed pain, eyes fixed on Yakid, and him. Orhan turned to Yakid, and the criminal's eyes met his. In that moment, the battlefield narrowed back into a single question: how to kill justice's enemy without letting the criminal write the next chapter. "Yakid," Orhan said, raising his voice so it carried to every listening ear, "you have run through forests, you have hidden in smoke, you have escaped duels, but you bleed. You cannot outrun blood forever. You will run to the place where you believe you are safest. That is where we will meet you." Yakid's mouth curled. "And where is it, your fortress?" "My fortress will be guarded," Orhan answered. "My army will be disciplined, my scouts will move, your safety will be imagination." Then Orhan signaled to Faladios not to strike, not yet, but to watch and wait. "You will not chase his feet. You will guard your own life. When the horns call again, we will hear them with clear minds. That is how we win the war that follows this duel." Malik al-Yadin's archers released another volley, and the ridge erupted into sudden chaos. Orhan's soldiers surged, shields aligning, swords drawn, while Orhan guided Faladios backward a step to avoid arrows that could find the gap between shoulder and shield. The close-quarters fighting began anew beneath the slope, with men grabbing grips on ropes and dragging fallen archers aside before they could be trampled. Smoke rose from burning brush where arrows had struck dry pine needles, and fire's orange light flickered through the gray morning like a warning written in flame. Then the horns sounded again, different now, frantic. It was the horn of men who had discovered their block had failed, of a battle turning in a direction they did not expect. A new captain emerged from the smoky mist, not Damir Khan, not Mustafa. It was one of the smaller commanders Orhan had placed earlier, a man named Killil, his face covered in ash, his eyes wide as if he had witnessed something that had cracked his beliefs. "Commander," Killil shouted, and his voice carried the tremor of catastrophe. "The pass is not opened for refugees, it is opened for an enemy banner. Jarkata Sahib he is holding, but the enemy numbers." "Who?" Orhan demanded. Killil swallowed. "From the east side, from outside Malik's camp, a force bearing old colors. Shahanshah's remaining captains, they have regrouped under a new standard, not Malik's." Orhan's blood cooled. Shahanshah was dead, but remnants of his rule had not vanished like smoke. They had merely waited for the right moment to return, and Yakid had chosen that moment carefully, at once using his escape to provoke betrayal and using confusion to lure other forces into the open. Orhan lifted his chin toward the smoke-thick sky. "Fate is not mercy," he murmured. Behind him, Faladios's voice was low and furious. Then Yakid's escape was not a retreat, it was a signal. Yakid stepped back, half hidden in the chaos, his gaze fixed not only on Orhan but on the approaching banners in the mist. He looked almost satisfied, as if chaos itself were his ally. For a heartbeat, Orhan considered what he wanted most: to end Yakid's breath with his own oath, to cut his head from his body and stop the war with a single final stroke. But he remembered Kalimdar's halls and the lesson of Shahanshah's death. Killing a tyrant does not always kill the tyrant system. It can sometimes only remove the face that made the cruelty obvious, leaving cruelty to find new faces. Orhan pointed toward the ridge's far side, toward where his scouts said the stone pass narrowed into a choke. Tarhan, take 100. You will intercept those old banner remnants before they join Malik's forces. Do not fight to kill them all, fight to slow them. I will handle Yakid. Faladio stared. Handle him. Orhan's expression hardened into something colder than rage. We are done with duels that he can escape by smoke. If he will not die by sword, he will die by siege of his choices. Yakid's eyes narrowed, sensing that Orhan was changing tactics again. You cannot siege a man with no walls, he hissed. I can, Orhan replied. I can siege the roots that your feet require. I can siege your shelter. I can siege your messengers, and then your courage will starve. Tarhan moved out with speed, men falling into formation like arrows aligning with a bow. Faladios limped forward one step, unwilling to accept separation from justice, but Orhan's hand pressed firmly on his shoulder, stern, unyielding. Your rage will serve justice by staying alive, Orhan said. Faladios clenched his teeth, but he obeyed. He had sworn before, an oath binds more than anger. Orhan turned then toward Yakid, stepping into the thick smoke and shouting over the clash of steel. Men heard him and understood the command's shape immediately. Not run, not kill, but contain. The army shifted formation so that Yakid's escape corridors would be covered, so that he could not melt into forest shadow again. Orhan moved with Tarhan's earlier lessons: never chase the opponent's intention, chase the opponent's need. Yakid tried to retreat through a narrow gap between stones. Two of Orhan's men closed it at once. He pivoted toward a second gap and another pair closed it. He began to realize the truth. Orhan was not hunting him with speed alone. He was hunting him with enclosure. Yakid cursed, lifting his blade. You will kill me and call it justice. Orhan's eyes remained fixed, his voice quiet but absolute. I will kill you and call it accountability. Steel rose in one final clash of close quarters. Yakid struck hard, desperate, and for an instant Orhan felt the blade's edge kiss his guard and vibrate through the metal into his bones. Tarhan's shield came up beside Orhan's shoulder, reinforcing the defense. Men stepped in, pushing Yakid's body backward, controlling his reach. Then Yakid's remaining strength gave a false burst. He drove forward, aiming to break the formation. His sword slipped between shields and nearly found a throat. Orhan saw it and moved, not with fear but with a precise counter, knocking the blade aside and forcing Yakid into the open. In that exposed moment, Orhan saw something on Yakid's belt, a small roll of parchment tied with red cord, a letter, evidence, something he intended to deliver at a critical moment. Orhan's eyes flashed. You carry proof. Yakid's smile returned, thin as a knife. Proof that will burn Malik Aliuddin's name. Proof that will poison your alliances. Proof that will divide your army. You want justice, then you want to know who else is complicit. Orhan's hand reached fast and tore the parchment from Yakid's belt. Yakid's face twisted, not in pain alone, but in rage at losing the timing he had prepared. You thought you controlled smoke, Orhan said. Now you will taste it. He signaled immediately. Take him alive if possible. If he resists, end him. But first remove that parchment from sight, hide it and protect it. No traitor touches it. Men surged. Yakid struggled like a trapped serpent, his blade flaring, his breathing harsh. He swung again and again, but his blood loss slowed his power. Orhan watched carefully, never losing the rhythm of command. Then with one final strike, Tarhan's sword struck Yakid's arm, disarming him. The parchment was already gone. The man without his proof was a criminal without his final weapon. Yakid fell to his knees in the dirt and looked up at Orhan, eyes wild. You will still lose, he rasped, because you can't kill every man who obeyed Shahanshah's shadow. Orhan leaned close enough that only breath separated them. Then I will kill enough to make the shadow unable to find new bodies. Yakid's gaze flicked to the distance where chaos continued, where old banner remnants might soon collide with Malik Aliuddin's disciplined ranks, where betrayal's fire might leap into an even larger war. In his eyes, Orhan saw a truth that chilled him. Yakid had not planned only his escape. He had planned the war's continuation. As Orhan's soldiers dragged Yakid to captivity, a final horn sounded from the east. It was long, harsh, and full of urgency. The kind of horn that means an army has arrived faster than scouts predicted, that means the next battle is already written, that means rest is a lie told by exhausted men. Tarhan returned at a run, smoke in his hair and blood on his sleeve, his face set in grim focus. "Commander," he shouted, "we slowed them, but they are not stopping. Their banners number more than we expected. And Malik al-Yadin, he has ordered his archers to aim not at our outer line, but toward Kalamdar's wounded stores." Orhan's stomach tightened, "So he prepares to burn our supplies." "Aye," Tarhan said, "he claims he fears plague, but his men move with the calm of arsonists who have already chosen what excuse they will use." Orhan looked at the sky, pale now with dawn's first light. The clouds thinned but did not clear, as if fate itself refused to reveal the whole map. Smoke still rose from burning brush, steel still rang in distant clashes, and Yakid, captured, wounded, furious, watched it all with the cold patience of a man who believed the war would outlive his capture. Orhan steadied his voice so all could hear. "Spread the order," he said. "No one burns without command. No one executes outside judgment. We will not become like Shahanshah. We will be worse for our enemies only in outcomes, not in methods." Then he turned toward Faladios, who leaned on his sword, face pale beneath soot. "Bandage your shoulder," Orhan told him, "because the next battle will demand every ounce of your oath." Faladios swallowed, and the pain in his face did not soften. "And Yakid?" Orhan looked down at the parchment sealed in an oilcloth carried by a guard close to him. He understood now that killing Yakid would not end the weapon he had carried into the world. The letter's existence could spark feuds, could expose allies to accusation, could drive neutrality into war. Orhan bent slightly, so his words landed close to Yakid's ear. "Tonight," Orhan said, "you will learn what it means to be surrounded without smoke. Tonight, you will learn that your tricks can be used against you." Yakid laughed weakly. "Then march," he rasped. "Let's see if you can outpace the consequences you just invited." And as if the world itself had answered that challenge, riders appeared at the edge of the ridge, 3 at first, then 5, then a full knot, bringing news that contradicted earlier reports. Malik al-Yadin's camp was not merely preparing defense. It was preparing withdrawal in a manner that looked like mercy but smelled like escape. Old banner remnants from Shahanshah's remaining captains were taking positions near the river, as if a new siege line was being drawn. And in the western hills, far beyond immediate sight, lights flickered through mist, village fires beginning, not random but coordinated, like signals to those waiting for chaos to make their work easier. Orhan Sahib stood in the dawn smoke with Yakid in chains and battle horns still echoing. The fortress was taken, the tyrant was dead, the duel had ended without finishing, yet the war did not loosen its grip. It only tightened, shifting from one blade to many blades, from one betrayal to an entire web. History does not end when a king falls. History only changes its voice. And tonight, even as guards tightened around Yakid and captains argued over roads and supplies, Orhan felt the inevitability of the next march, felt it in the rising wind, in the ember-dry smell of distant fires, in the sound of steel that never truly stops when fate has tasted blood. The riders returned before dawn, their horses flecked with foam and their faces carrying the weight of news that would not wait for the courtesies of formal audience. Orhan received them in the chamber that had belonged to Shahanshah, a room still stained with the evidence of its former occupants' paranoid final days. Maps scattered across tables and half-burned documents revealing the depth of suspicion that had consumed a man who trusted no one and therefore could be trusted by no one in return. Tarhan stood at the doorway as the lead rider delivered his report, his hand resting on his sword hilt with the casual readiness that never abandoned him regardless of circumstances. The news was worse than anticipated, carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate question of Yakid's location into territories of political consequence that demanded immediate attention. Malik al-Yadin had received Yakid not merely as a refugee, but as an honored guest, had provided quarters within his own palace, and had been seen dining publicly with the fugitive in displays of solidarity that could not be misinterpreted. More troubling still, messengers had been observed traveling between al-Yadin's court and the territories of 3 other lords whose neutrality Orhan had purchased through the same assurances that should have bound al-Yadin to non-interference. The coalition that had enabled the Kalamdar campaign was fracturing before the fortress's walls had even cooled from the fires of its capture. "They fear you now," Tarhan observed when the riders had been dismissed to find rest and food. Your success has become a threat that unites those who might otherwise remain divided. Alauddin sees a conqueror rather than a justice seeker, and he is not alone in that perception. Orhan absorbed this assessment without visible reaction, though internally he acknowledged the truth it contained. Victory often proved more dangerous than defeat, success breeding opposition that failure would never have generated. He had taken Kalimdar through methods that demonstrated capabilities no neighboring lord could ignore, and now those lords were asking themselves whether they might be next, whether the grievances Orhan had cited against Shahanshah might be manufactured as easily against any of them. "We need allies," Orhan said finally. "Not purchased neutrality, not temporary accommodations, but genuine alliance with lords who understand that their interests align with ours. Alauddin moves against us because he believes he can build a coalition stronger than anything we can assemble in response. We must prove him wrong before his coalition solidifies into something that requires war to dissolve." The strategy that emerged from the councils of the following days represented a fundamental shift in Orhan's approach, a recognition that conquest alone could not secure the position he had achieved. Emissaries departed toward every corner of the region, carrying proposals crafted to appeal to the specific interests of each potential ally. To lords who feared Alauddin's growing influence, Orhan offered protection and partnership against a neighbor whose ambitions threatened their independence. To those whose commercial interests had suffered under Shahanshah's disruptions, he offered favorable trading arrangements through territories now under his control. To commanders whose talents had been overlooked by masters too foolish to recognize competence, he offered positions of authority and the promise of campaigns that would bring wealth and glory to those who fought beneath his banner. Valadios chafed under these diplomatic delays, his hatred for Yakid burning with intensity that diplomatic maneuvering could not satisfy. Each day that passed without direct action against the fugitive felt to him like betrayal of the blood debt that demanded payment, and Orhan found himself spending increasing amounts of time managing his commander's frustration rather than focusing on the strategic challenges that multiplied with each passing hour. "You ask me to wait," Valadios said during one particularly heated exchange, his voice carrying edges that bordered on insubordination. "While the man who murdered my nephew breathes and plots and builds strength that will eventually be turned against us. How long must I endure this waiting? How many more councils and embassies and careful calculations before steel is finally permitted to settle what words cannot?" "Until the moment is right," Orhan replied, his patience tested but not yet exhausted. "You see only Yakid, but I must see the entire board upon which this game is played. Strike too soon and we face not one enemy but a coalition of enemies united by fear of our aggression. Strike at the right moment and Yakid falls alone, abandoned by allies who recognize that supporting him means sharing his fate. Your vengeance will come, Valadios. I swear it upon the graves of my ancestors and the honor of my house. But it will come in a manner that serves our larger purposes rather than satisfying impulses that, however justified, would cost us everything we have fought to achieve." The first break in the diplomatic stalemate came from an unexpected direction, carried by a merchant whose commercial interests had been devastated by the chaos that Yakid's flight had generated. This man, whose name was Tamir and whose network of trading contacts extended across 6 provinces, had observed patterns in Alauddin's preparations that suggested the Lord was planning something more ambitious than merely sheltering a fugitive. Caravans carrying weapons had been diverted from their usual routes, moving instead toward Alauddin's territories in quantities that far exceeded any defensive requirement. Engineers with experience in siege warfare had been recruited from distant cities, their expertise suggesting preparations for offensive operations rather than the fortification of existing positions. "He means to attack," Tamir concluded, his voice carrying the certainty of a man whose livelihood depended on accurate assessment of political currents. "Not immediately, but soon. The weapons being gathered, the engineers being recruited, the alliances being forged, these are not the preparations of a lord who wishes merely to maintain his position. Alauddin sees opportunity in the chaos you have created, and he means to exploit it before you can consolidate what you have gained." This intelligence transformed Orhan's understanding of the situation in ways that demanded immediate strategic adjustment. He had been operating under the assumption that patience would allow the natural tensions within Alauddin's nascent coalition fracture the alliance before it could threaten his position. But if Alauddin was preparing for offensive action, patience became a liability rather than an asset, each day of delay allowing the enemy to strengthen while Orhan's own position remained static. "How long before these preparations are complete?" Orhan demanded. "A month, perhaps less," Tamir replied. "The weapons are already moving, the engineers have already arrived. The only delay is in coordinating with the other lords whose support Alauddin requires. Once that coordination is achieved, the campaign against you will begin." The council that convened that night included every senior commander in Orhan's forces, their faces grave as they absorbed the implications of Tamir's intelligence. The mathematics of their situation had shifted dramatically, from a position of strength to one of desperate vulnerability. Kalimdar's garrison had been destroyed, but reinforcements to replace it had not yet arrived. The territories conquered during the campaign remained unsecured, their populations uncertain about whether the new order would prove permanent or merely a temporary disruption before the restoration of the status quo. And the coalition that Ali-Eddin was assembling commanded combined forces that would outnumber Orhan's army by margins that made conventional defense impossible. "We must attack first," Faladios urged, his earlier frustrations finding validation in circumstances that seemed to demand exactly the aggressive action he had been advocating. "Strike before they are ready, while their preparations remain incomplete, while the coordination they require remains imperfect. Take the war to Ali-Eddin's territory and force him to defend rather than attack. And expose our flanks to the other members of his coalition," Tarhin countered. "While we commit forces against Ali-Eddin, his allies move against territories we cannot protect. We have neither the numbers nor the position to sustain offensive operations against multiple enemies simultaneously." The debate continued through the night, arguments advancing and retreating like armies across contested ground, until finally Orhan imposed the silence that preceded command decisions. His face bore the weariness of a man who understood that every choice available to him carried consequences that might prove fatal, that the path forward led through dangers that could not be avoided, but only navigated with whatever skill and fortune fate might provide. "We will do both," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of finality that ended discussion. "We will attack but not Ali-Eddin. We will strike instead at the weakest member of his coalition, a blow so swift and devastating that the other members question whether their alliance serves their interests. At the same time, we will send emissaries to those whose commitment to Ali-Eddin remains uncertain, offering terms that make defection more attractive than continued opposition. Divide the enemy before engaging him directly, and transform a war against many into a war against few." The target chosen was a lord named Zarkin, whose territories bordered the mountains through which Orhan had passed during the approach to Kalimdar. Zarkin had joined Ali-Eddin's coalition reluctantly, motivated more by fear of isolation than genuine commitment to the alliance's objectives, and intelligence suggested that his forces remained dispersed across his territories rather than concentrated in defensive positions. More importantly, Zarkin's domain contained the passes through which any army moving against Orhan would need to travel, making its control strategically essential regardless of the broader diplomatic situation. The campaign against Zarkin began 3 days later, a forced march through terrain that exhausted men and horses alike, but delivered Orhan's forces to their objective before any warning could precede them. The first of Zarkin's outposts fell within hours, its garrison surrendering after token resistance that preserved honor without sacrificing lives pointlessly. The second fell that same day, and by nightfall, Orhan controlled the western approaches to Zarkin's heartland while the lord himself remained unaware that war had come to his domain. Faladios led the advance guard with energy that seemed to draw strength from the violence he had long craved, his sword finding work that it had been denied during weeks of diplomatic maneuvering. Each engagement increased his reputation among the soldiers who fought beside him, each victory adding to the legend of a commander whose presence on a battlefield guaranteed success regardless of odds. But Orhan watched his lieutenant with concern that grew alongside the campaign's progress, recognizing signs of an appetite that might prove difficult to control when the immediate objectives had been achieved. Zarkin's capital fell on the 5th day, its walls breached not through siege but through the treachery of a garrison commander who had been promised rewards that Zarkin could never match. The lord himself was captured attempting to flee through tunnels that Orhan's agents had sealed hours before the assault began, and when he was brought before Orhan, his face carried the bewilderment of a man who could not understand how complete defeat had arrived so quickly. "Your coalition has failed you," Orhan said, standing over his prisoner with the calm certainty of a man who understood exactly what this victory meant. "Where is Ali-Eddin's promised support? Where are the armies that were supposed to protect you against exactly this eventuality? You trusted a man whose word proved worthless, and now you will pay the price of that misplaced trust." "Kill me, then," Zarkin replied, his voice steady despite circumstances that would have broken many men. "I am not the first lord to fall in these conflicts, and I will not be the last. My death changes nothing. Ali-Eddin will still come for you, and when he does, you will discover that my territories are not enough to withstand the storm that approaches." But Orhan had no intention of killing Zarkin, recognizing that a living prisoner served purposes that a corpse could never achieve. The captured lord was treated with courtesy that bordered on honor, housed in comfortable chambers, and provided with every amenity his station would have enjoyed under normal circumstances. This treatment was not mercy but calculation, a demonstration to other members of Ali-Eddin's coalition that defeat at Orhan's hands need not mean destruction, that accommodation remained possible for those wise enough to choose submission over resistance. The news of Zarkin's fall traveled faster than any courier could carry it, spreading through the network of informants and merchants and frightened officials who populated every court in the region. Within days, the coalition that Al-Yadin had so carefully assembled began to show cracks that widened with each passing hour. Lords who had committed to support against Orhan now claimed that their promises had been conditional, dependent on circumstances that no longer applied. Military preparations that had been accelerating suddenly slowed as commanders questioned whether the campaign they had been planning might lead to outcomes that no one desired. And in Al-Yadin's court, Yaqid found his position deteriorating with speed that must have been bewildering to a man who had believed himself secure just days before. The lord who had welcomed him as an honored guest now treated him with coldness that bordered on hostility, recognizing that continued association with the fugitive threat to draw the very destruction that Al-Yadin had been preparing to inflict upon others. Orhan's agents within the court reported that arguments had erupted between Yaqid and his protector, that accusations of betrayal and incompetence had been exchanged in terms that permitted no reconciliation. "The moment approaches," Tarhan observed as these reports accumulated. "Al-Yadin must choose between Yaqid and his own survival. No lord willingly invites destruction upon himself for the sake of a guest whose value has been demonstrated to be less than the cost of protecting him." Orhan nodded slowly, his attention focused on the final pieces of the strategy he had been assembling since the campaign began. Zarkin's territories had been secured, their population accepting new authority with the resignation of people who had learned through generations of conflict that resistance only prolonged suffering. The passes that controlled access to the broader region were now garrisoned by troops whose loyalty had been purchased through combinations of reward and intimidation that left no doubt about the consequences of betrayal. And the coalition that had threatened to overwhelm Orhan's position had fragmented into individual lords scrambling to protect their own interests rather than pursuing collective objectives that no longer seemed achievable. "Send word to Al-Yadin," Orhan commanded. "Offer him terms that preserve his dignity while surrendering his guest. Make clear that our conflict is with Yaqid alone, that the grievances that brought us to this region will be satisfied by justice against the man who committed the crimes, not by war against lords who merely offered him temporary shelter. Give Al-Yadin the opportunity to retreat without appearing to have been defeated, and he will take it." The embassy departed the following morning, carrying proposals that had been crafted with attention to every nuance of diplomatic language that might influence their reception. Orhan waited for response with patience that he had learned through years of conflict, understanding that haste at this stage might undo everything that careful strategy had achieved. The outcome he sought required Al-Yadin to choose betrayal, to hand over a man who had been received as a guest, and such choices could not be forced but only enabled through circumstances that made alternatives unacceptable. The response came on the third day, carried by messengers whose bearing suggested that the news they bore would satisfy the man who awaited it. Al-Yadin had accepted the terms, had agreed to surrender Yaqid in exchange for assurances that his territories would not be attacked and his authority would not be questioned. The handover would take place at a location midway between their respective forces, with guarantees provided by neutral parties whose honor bound both sides to observe the agreements that had been reached.